Thank you. I'd like to offer some remarks on Barfield's relation to a visionary tradition and to contexts of poetry and metaphysics that have a rich heritage in the Neoplatonic tradition. 2020 marks the centenary of Barfield's form in poetry, one of his earliest published writings on the nature of language and meaning. In 1926, Barfield published the book History in English Words, where he wrote that language has preserved for us the inner living history of man's soul. It reveals the evolution of consciousness. Poetic diction, a study in meaning, a wide-ranging and deeply considered exploration of the nature of meaning, poetic experience and the imagination, followed in 1928. And this book was to have a noted impact upon the thought of Lewis, Tolkien and other Inklings. Barfield's work can be said to call to a visionary experience in the redemption and rediscovery of meaning. It is a thinking that transfigures experience into a participation of the individual and the divine. The emphases upon language explore utterances that convey meaning created, meaning incarnate, of noetic inspiration renewed in the legacies of the Neoplatonic tradition, in which there is a kinship and participation in archetypal images. Barfield wrote that words are only themselves by being more than themselves. Perhaps the same thing is true of human beings. This sense of the plenitude in which meaning is created is linked to a Platonic education of the soul, a direction to contemplation and to the potentiality of being. It is, one could say, a rekindled light of the imaginative interconnection of the true, the good, and the beautiful. A Barfieldian understanding of these ideas in the evolution of consciousness transforms the nature of meaning by seeing a communion in the one and the many, spirit's self-consciousness, realized in the direction to a renewed participation in poetic diction, a direction back, but also forwards to the common origin of inner and outer forms. Barfield suggests that the harp and the camera place us in a relation of change to the adaptations of modern consciousness, to those inner and outer worlds, and forgetting of their commonality and kinship. The combination of inspiration and projection, of our relation to the chasm between subject and object, are placed upon the motion of the winds of meaning that is the spirit and the breath of life, the animating, creative sense of being. Coleridge wrote in the Aeolian Harp, "And what if all of animated nature be but organic harps diversely framed, that tremble into thought as over them sweeps, plastic and vast, one intellectual breeze, at once the soul of each and God of all." And Barfield in The Harp and the Camera, "Is it fanciful, I wonder, to think of a sort of mini-harp stretched across the window of the eye, an Apollo's harp, if you will, as perhaps not a bad image for the joy of looking with imagination?" In his Coleridgean modes, Barfield's is a philosophy of inspiration. He wrote that it was held by Coleridge that the human imagination at its highest level does indeed inherit and continue the divine creative activity of the Logos, which was the common origin of human language and consciousness, as well as of the world which contains them. So too, we might attribute such feeling to many of his own ideas and of the deep interest of his philological work and the evolution of consciousness. Great poetry, wrote Barfield, is the progressive incarnation of life and consciousness. The task of poetic expression, shaped by the energies of imaginative diction, is to enrich the reciprocity of inner spiritual consciousness with the choice of inspired projection, to actively participate in the world of meaning in the speaking of the creative breath of the Logos, to reanimate and re-enchant nature. Barfield's writings offer a key to unlock some of the historical and theological significance of the prologue to the Gospel of John, and of the nature of meaning, creativity, and the word. The word for wind here in Greek means both spirit and wind, and Barfield has frequently drawn attention to this matter and the nature of divine inspiration. To be inspired by spirit is to enter into an inner relation with the divine and the world of spirit in which the soul is present and participates. Barfield conveys how poetic diction and the truth of the living imagination compel us to significant meaning, connecting to Coleridge's living power and prime agent of all human perception, a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. There is a choice of imaginative engagement and contemplation to a felt change of consciousness in which we become inspired by the feeling of the creative Logos, in which a transposition of the spirit is felt, where numinous mystery is disclosed in everyday occurrence. The idea of participation involves a choice, an activity of the imagination, a rediscovery of meaning. Barfield variously expresses the point, but this is a renewed responsibility of the relation to nature and a self-recognition of the inner origin of outward forms. In this way, Barfield's thought on the transformative power of the poetic and of his comments on the developing stream of Neoplatonic thought, where he speaks of verse in which one feels moving the breath of the creative word, the breath of the Logos, and of a deep human response to the Logos, the breath that is alone the true breath of poetry, might be framed in relation to Platonian themes of beauty and contemplation, of how things here become beautiful by participation in forms and in an association with the divine forms. There is an assent to the contemplation of the beautiful, and we are often reminded by Barfield that words are the imaginative nexus of the material and immaterial, of the breath and the spirit, of the Logos as word and meaning. Articulated meaning in poetic utterance, when it moves with the same inspiration of this spirit, diffuses experience with an appearance of the eternal. We must then ascend to the good which every soul desires, says Plotinus, and the repeated ideas of participation, kinship, and a sharing in the divine are felt too in Barfield's emphases on the distinctions of our relation to the divine in the nature of language. Barfield's image of the window, of the inspired vision of the harp stretched across the eye, appeals to a renewed way of seeing, to a recognition of the reciprocity of meaning between the human and the divine, of the likeness that is the polarity that underlies the relationship. This is what he calls a joy of looking with imagination. The historical self-consciousness, evolved to the dualism of mind and spirit, calls to a new form of experience, which in the dialectic of harp and camera is a frame of the limitation of our perceptions, but of the potentiality of their association to the archetypes which give them meaning. Barfield draws attention to a passage in Plotinus cited by Coleridge, something that speaks to a philosophy of imagination and to the rediscovery of meaning that partakes again the sacred character of knowledge. For the one who sees has a kinship with that which is seen, and he must make himself the same as it if he is to attain the sight. For no eye has ever seen the sun without becoming sunlike, nor could a soul ever see beauty without becoming beautiful. The visionary frame of the inspired harp across the lens of the projective eye of modern self-consciousness is an evolution of thought to the numinous kinship of being, a relation historically reciprocated in the light of understanding, but temporarily felt as a loss. The interest in Barfield's work and the Coleridgean imagination that informs it is to a renewed participation in this light.
Okay, so we are recording.
In an Aeolian manner.
Great. So thank you very much, Gareth. It's a great honor to have Mark with us, who has done much to excite interest in Barfield's thought with his latest publication. Mark, I wonder if you could introduce yourself to us and give us your paper.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a joy to be here. Just as a quick footnote, actually, when Maria was talking, my copy of Solovyov's The Meaning of Love has an introduction by Barfield in it, which I guess is the essay. So, you know, just to note that. Yeah, so I think I first heard of Owen Barfield actually through Simon Conway Morris. Yeah, through Simon Conway Morris, when he was talking about the evolution of language. So he's an evolutionary biologist in Cambridge too. So just that's one direction that Barfield was inspiring. I then also came across Barfield when I did a PhD on Plato's dialogue, the Lysis, and felt the whole time that I didn't really understand what was going on, even though I got the PhD. And it wasn't until I really read Barfield afterwards that he said the first thing to do when reading Plato is to unthink everything you think you know, that I began to see there was more going on. So that was a philosophical bit that Barfield touched. And then I've got a sort of history with Christianity one way or another. And it's really only since I've read Barfield that I felt more at home in what Christianity presents particularly as an evolution of consciousness, as a movement of the soul within history. And that is what my book focuses on. I wanted to partly sort of slightly proclaim the word. I work as a journalist as well as a psychotherapist, and so wanted to write about that. But also see really whether Barfield's ideas do actually still stack up, particularly the ones that are presented in Saving the Appearances, 50 or so years on, in the light of more recent scholarship. So whilst my book is written for a popular audience, I did try to take seriously scholarship as much as I could too. And it's to give a taste of that now that I thought I could offer something to the day. It was really helpful actually reading the Camera and the Harp before, because Barfield himself said he had one big idea that he kept sort of revisiting and amplifying in different ways. And reading the essay now, I felt so much of what he thought was going on in Christianity was woven beneath the words of that essay. For example, Coleridge's remark there that the soul of each and God of all, I think that Barfield felt that is exactly what the incarnation sort of showed. I think he was much more into this Platonic idea that Christianity reveals things to us that then through our participation with them evolves and takes on. That very much struck me when I was reading the essay again. And I mean, just to cut to the chase, the research which I try and present in the book in this accessible way very much supported actually what Barfield was saying. I mean, quite to my surprise, how much it did so. It really encouraged me actually that this Barfieldian way of reading Christianity needn't just be a kind of niche interest. I mean, I would go so far as to say I wonder whether it can even help save Christianity from many of the troubles that it faces now. So I've become quite evangelical about it. He felt this happened via a process of evolution. The idea that our experience of what it is to be human, to relate to nature, the cosmos, the world around us, as well as to ourselves, does unfold, does radically change. So when, for example, Shelley in that essay, his remark, there is a power by which we are surrounded, like the atmosphere in which some motionless lyre is suspended, which visits with its breath our silent chords at will. I think that Barfield felt that in broadly speaking, the three phases that he tracked, which were the ancient phase, the time of Homer, and say the earliest parts of the Hebrew Bible, then the phase of pre-Christendom and then Christianity in its early and medieval phases, that would be a second sort of phase, and then now the modern period. Those were the phases I think he most focused on, simply because there were rich texts, rich words to investigate, which was his kind of his data, if you like. He felt that had evolved and shifted, and particularly it's evolved and shifted because of the way that the individual relates to what's going on, and the part played by the individual. So this very much spoke to what he was highlighting in the essay there about, are the harp and the camera at war, or are they able to speed along the highway, as Malcolm just indicated he does on his motorbike just there, in a new way. And I think he thought the latter, not necessarily in relation to Malcolm and his motorbike, but nonetheless, that was what he was helping us to feel towards. So let me just kind of run through a bit how I think Barfield saw this unfolding in relation to Christianity explicitly, if we've been looking at the harp essay and thinking about it in that way. So I think that when he turned to Homer, he saw very much the harp experience of consciousness participation in its, as he put it, original participative form. So let me just see whether I can show a quick slide now, because it does just come up so clearly. If I share screen, can you enable me to share a screen there, Douglas? It asked me to.
Wait a minute.
Ask the host.
Share screen.
Yes, if you can enable share screening, just see whether this works for a moment or two. If not, it's not crucial, but if it does.
Desktop 1.
So host enable. Have you enabled it now?
I think
I
so.
think you might be sharing yours, Douglas.
Yeah.
So it says to host, to enable attendee screen sharing.
Okay, wait a minute. Manage. It says invite manage participants, share screen, and then does this? What is this? Share screen. I wonder if this is it. Multiple participants can share simultaneously. Is that right? Let me try this. Is this working?
Yes, I can now share a screen. So if I do this, that's great.
Okay.
And with luck, if I slideshow from current slide, hopefully you can see now an image.
It's a great picture.
Yeah, so this is an image from illustrating Homer's Iliad. It's one of the moments where Achilles is very angry with Agamemnon. And but what's so interesting, that's both in the text and very clear and vivid in this image, is that Achilles doesn't actually strike Agamemnon because he has a kind of crisis of conscience or thinks better of his action. He doesn't strike Agamemnon because Athena literally pulls back his head and stops him from doing it. And this is a dominant sense that you have in these texts of how the gods and mortals related, which feels very much like, as it were, Athena the harp, in that moment anyway, playing Achilles. Achilles' strength is there. You know, he's not just kind of completely written over, but nonetheless, that is what is motivating him. If I come now back, is that cut off the screen now and just come back to me?
No, the screen's still there.
Okay, so I'll stop share right now. So I've just got, so that's done that now. Good. Thanks very much for getting the hang of that. I think another another example from the Hebrew tradition in this early period. I wonder whether this old consciousness is remembered in the story of Abraham and Isaac. You know, it's become a sort of moral conundrum for us now, why Abraham would possibly take Isaac up the mountain to slay him. But if you read it with Barfield's idea of original participation, Abraham is following what the gods told him to do. And so it feels like a similar sense of inspiration. And of course, the angel then appears, who often in this period, angels and gods in God's self get sort of overlaid on each other, and tells Abraham not to slay Isaac, but to slay the ram instead. And I think this story perhaps gets remembered because it becomes a remembrance of an older consciousness that then people wrestle with and struggle with. So it becomes a kind of productive story for the new consciousness that was emerging when it gets written down and remembered as we receive it now. So you can look across quite a wide range of old stories, particularly from the Hebrew and the Homeric tradition, and see this older participation, this original participation in action. It begins to change. In my book, I try to look at how it begins to change, particularly in the middle part of the first millennium BC. I think a really key set of events that fostered this shift of consciousness was the loss first of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, Judah and Israel, to the in the exiles, and the effects of particularly the kings of Judah to respond to this had the effect of intensifying individuality, intensifying the individual consciousness of God. So, for example, I think this is fairly robust scholarship now. This is when biblical texts start getting written down for the first time. And it seems that Hezekiah did this because he had pulled people back from relating to the old sacred lands, burial sites, the sites of the old gods in the centralization around Jerusalem. So he did it in a way to try and consolidate his power. But it has the effect of shifting people's relationships to Yahweh, because they now do it through a written text rather than, say, through ritual associated with land or a felt experience of the divine in relation to, say, Mount Zion. And of course, when you read a text, you have to foster something within yourself to make the words sort of come back to life, or at least to have the vitality of the words speak to you. So it becomes a much more interior activity. So in the Deuteronomic reforms, for example, I think that they reform the old law to quite explicitly, actually, in parts, cultivate the emphasis upon the individual. So, for example, it's now said that the sins of the fathers won't visit upon the third and fourth generation, that the individual must, as it were, take responsibility. And so that is part of this sense of withdrawing, to use Barfield's phrase, from the original participation and beginning to cultivate a sense of reciprocal participation with the divine. You see the same thing, I think, happening in the Hebrew tradition, in the Greek tradition. I think you see it very dramatically, if I can just try and share some slides again, with statuary. Now, I hope you can see this now if I go from play from current slide. Yeah. So in the 5th century, you get this very dramatic shift in the statuary of the particularly Athenian world. Here are the early statues of the Kuroi and the Kors, the male and female figures. And I think these are still very attached to original participation. These are individuals who, as it were, being played by what we now might call the archetypal forces of masculinity and femininity, or the male and female. You know, they don't feel like they have an interiority. They're not individuals. You know, the chap there is not being sculpted because the sculptor asked Joe next door to sit for him. This sculpture has been formed using sacred proportions, actually. In fact, the dimensions of the body are similar across Egypt, let alone just within Greece too. You begin to get this shifting with these are kind of mid-5th century figures here, male and female. There's at the beginning the sense of individuality. So, for example, again, the male figure, just to focus on that, he looks as he does because he has been to a gym, not because he is being idealized according to sacred proportions. So there's a sense of the individual. And I think that their right arms don't survive, or at least their hands don't survive, because they were probably holding tools of their trade. Again, a sense of individuality, which made the sculpture fragile, so they got knocked off over a period of time. And then, of course, you come to the figures which we know and identify as even the kind of ideals of beauty in individual form at the end of the 5th century. And the significance of these figures, I think, is that the power of the individuals there, whether it be sporting or athletic power, or on the right there, the Hellenistic queen, her pure presence radiates from within them, rather than being reflected from without of them. So, the Discobulus there, it's his mental poise, which we feel as much as his physical prowess. And similarly, if that Hellenistic queen walked into the room, every eye would turn to her because of her physical beauty. So you see this very dramatically unfolding, I think, across this period of time, within a couple of generations or so, and move to a different kind of participation. It sets up, you might say, a dynamic gets going. I was very interested too, because of my past in Platonic philosophy, the significance of Socrates in this. And when you start reading Socrates with Barfieldian eyes, you just see it all over the place. So, Socrates asks questions. If you go to an Anglo-American philosophy department anyway now and ask why does Socrates ask questions, they'll probably tell you something like he was looking for good definitions, which just completely misses the point. I think Socrates is asking questions because he wants us to ask for ourselves what we think friendship is, what we think courage is, what we think the good life is, and taking us to those moments of aporia where we don't know, which is the beginning of cultivating a sense of that within ourselves. That's not just owning answers to these questions for ourselves, but also is enabling a shift in relationship to all these things to unfold as well. And you get that particularly in his confession of his own vocation in the Apology, where he talks about how he was inspired by his demon from a very early age. And what's so interesting about this demon, this go-between between him and Apollo, is that it always told him what not to do, he says. And this is a completely new relationship to the divine compared, say, to Achilles' relationship to the divine when Athena pulls back his hair. Because by being told not what to do, Socrates must bring everything of himself to the question of what to do. So he starts to cooperate with the god. He starts to have a reciprocal relationship with Apollo in this sense. Incidentally, I suspect he was also interested in Apollo rather than, say, Athena, as he might do as an Athenan, because Apollo, of course, means the not many. There's a sense of gathering in. So his individuality is getting gathered in relationship to the divine, rather than, I think, the older sense of participation, which was much more pantheistic, much more scattered. People felt different gods in relationship to different parts of their body and so on. So this unfolding is gathering pace both in the Hebraic world and differently, but in parallel ways, I think, in the Greek world too. And the significance of Christianity and of the figure of Jesus in particular is that it gathers it all together. So I'm just recalling my notes again now. Having to participate in the life of modern technology as well as everything else, but I'm getting there. Yeah, thanks. With the figure of Jesus. And this is in a way where I think that Barfield has a lot to say to modern Christianity, actually, because it's by cultivating the sense of the individual's relationship to the divine, that the old mystical sense, if you like, that Barfield really helped me find that again. You know, so I became very struck how Jesus teaches using parables. And these parables, certainly in my experience, are often presented as moral tales, which they more or less completely fail at, except for perhaps well-known examples like the Good Samaritan, because they don't seem very moral. But what they do, say, you know, the parable of the unjust judge, the parable of the workers, you know, where they all get paid the same, even if they only work 1 hour of the day. These are not moral, just tales of justice at all. But what they are is asking you to move to a point where you don't understand in order that the kingdom of God, to use Jesus's phrase, might become known within you. So there are, again, these disrupted, aporetic kind of tales that might take you to a completely different perception, rather than just the moral reading of them, which basically just extends the consciousness that you more or less know already anyway. I think that Jesus's stress on the, have you got the eyes that see, the ears that hear? I think this is his most common remark in one form or another in the New Testament, in the Gospels. It seems that if this is at all an accurate remembrance of the historical Jesus, this was the constant thing he was saying. Have you got the eyes you see? Have you got the ears that see? And of course, this is an echo of Isaiah, who I think is at the beginning of this unfolding. So that's why Jesus is picking it up. Everything he says about prayer focuses on the interiority of prayer, apart from the one exception, which everyone knows, which is the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father, which is a more collective sense. But otherwise, it's always, you know, does your right hand know what the left hand is doing? Go into the secret place where only your Father in heaven knows what's going on. And this is the deep stress, it seems, of Jesus' teaching on prayer, to stress this new consciousness, this new interiority. And then finally, I think also that Jesus reforms the apocalyptic expectations of his time. You know, this had been growing in the intertestamental period, actually both in the Greek world as well as in the Hebrew world. So in Hellenistic Judaism, as it had become, the idea that there would be some sort of end to history, a divine intervention from without again, that old imagining of the external out with inwards. But I think Jesus reforms that when, at least on occasion in the Gospels, he says, you know, don't look here, don't look there, the kingdom of God is within you. My sense is that these sayings got remembered by the synoptic Gospelers particularly because they couldn't really make sense of it. They still were inclined to think in the old apocalyptic ways, but they knew that Jesus had said them, so they recorded them nonetheless. They wrestled with them. And you can see the, as it were, the culmination of that wrestling, I think, in the later Pauline texts, where Paul eventually does get to, I'm taking on the mind of Christ. And of course, you see it in the Johannine Gospel as well, where there's no apocalyptic material, but there's all the sense of the I am, the sense of relating to Jesus in an interior way. I think reciprocal participation, you might say, in the Christian idiom was fully realized in the Johannine community. And that's why John wrote his gospel in that way. So anyway, conveying the sense that I think the reason why Christianity really took off, particularly around the Mediterranean world, is that it absolutely crystallized for people what had been unfolding through the Hellenistic period. Others have noticed this, actually. Others have noticed that it's in the Christian period that the sovereignty of the individual, the ontology of the individual really beds down. So Justin Martyr starts talking about free will in a way that we would recognize it. The notion of conscience, which is a bit in, say, the plays of Euripides, but it really settles down as a key subject for discussion in the Christian period. This is why Christianity, as it were, gets going, and it democratizes things too. It becomes something which, in principle, every individual can now experience, because the one individual, Jesus, was seen to have experienced. The incarnation is, as it were, it's not a one-off event. It becomes the type which is available to all to follow. And you see this particularly in the mystical traditions. So eventually someone like Meister Eckhart can write, you know, my eye and God's eye is one eye and one knowledge and one love. And you see in Dante's Divine Comedy, where Dante's journey to paradise is very much that his own desire, his own sight, his own knowledge, his own love becomes more and more harmonious with the divine sight, knowledge and love. And that's the divine incarnating in him and enables him to enter paradise through all the prior struggles. But then war breaks out between the harp and the camera once more, as Barfield mentions in the essay, in the Renaissance period. I mean, you can track it in the Enlightenment, of course, in the Reformation. I mean, just to show another couple of images, which again brought this very much to life for me once more. If I can get there again. These two images here. 1543 is the year that Copernicus publishes On the Revolution of Spheres. And before, this very well-known bookplate shows the individual completely participating in the whole cosmos as he searches for himself, searches nature and searches for the divine. After 1543, the significant thing here, I think, is not that the sun is at the center of things, but that the two human individuals are completely outside of everything as they look on and wonder what's going on. So, you know, this is a withdrawal of participation which characterizes the scientific revolution. They must work out how they can share in this cosmos that they're studying so brilliantly, actually. I mean, you know, this is a very much a Barfieldian theme. It's not one or the other. The withdrawal of participation very much enables things. But I guess that our focus with our interest in the Romantics is how we can combine that with a new sense of participation. And it's here that the imagination really starts to become important. In the history of words, actually, imagination is one of the words that Barfield thinks about quite a lot, and notices is that it's not really till Shakespeare and the Renaissance that imagination takes on the sense that we mean it now. With its ambivalence even, you know, Shakespeare makes the remark, the lunatic, the lover and the poet are of imagination all compact. You know, but are we being lovers? Are we being lunatics? Are we being poets? And when we turn to the imagination, you know, I think this is an interesting contrast, because when Plato talks about poetry, he talks about inspiration. He talks about being seized by the muse. Again, there's still the old sense now. Whereas with this now return to alienation of our own times, we've got a deeper problem, as it were. Imagination, I think, must do more work, you might say, which I think is why it starts to become, take on the importance that it does in the souls that are alert to what we need to struggle with this imagination, which we feel particularly in the Romantic tradition. Imagination, as it were, becomes the central issue, even, I would say. I think, you know, someone like William Blake was absolutely onto this. So hence he aligns Jesus with the imagination. This is the site of incarnation now, you might say, for William Blake. which we're still, I think, very much learning what to make sense of. You know, very nicely in the essay, Barfield is onto this as well, where he talks about Coleridge's sense that the sun paints the image, or his sense, he references Tolkien's notion of fairy, which of course is there's nothing more serious for Tolkien than the notion of fairy and fairyland. It too, on fairy stories, feels to me like it becomes Tolkien's notion of the incarnation too. I wanted just to conclude by where I think this practice of the imagination is romanticism come of age, or at least coming of age, to use Barfield's expression. You know, he felt that this is the way that we need to relate to this romantic tradition now, so that it can come of age. I think, you know, if I can put this a bit clunky, in a slightly clunky way, so that we don't just feel ourselves immersed and often overwhelmed with the sublime sense of the imagination in some of, say, Wordsworth's moments, but where we can become much more active participants with the imagination, and so can become, to use Blake's expression, creative with the imagination. That is the key dynamic, I think, for Blake, when we're doing this imagination in romanticism come of age, that we become active participants in how the imagination can create the world and not just relate to the world, lovely though that is. You know, so in Blake's mode, I think when you see the world in a grain of sand, that's great for the grain of sand as well as for the human being that's having that experience. It's about lifting nature to all it can be in that creative process, as well as just learning to relate to nature afresh in the imagination. And I think psychotherapy at its best does some of this. Just another final couple of minutes. You know, I think Donald Winnicott is a key figure here. He's very much of this romantic tradition, and I think is someone who is trying to help romanticism come of age too. One way he does that is in his reform of Freud's notion of fantasy. You know, Freud has the rather lunatic and lover notion of fantasy in his psychotherapy. He thought that, you know, if we're lucky, we develop fantasies that help us through sublimation to manage to live happily enough in the world. But I think that what Winnicott realized is that imagination must be doing a whole lot more than that, because you know, what the imagination enables us to do is not just kind of find a way through life in more or less mad ways, which is sort of Freud's implication, more or less neurotic ways, but actually to feel at home in the world, to feel that we can dialogue with the world, that we can become creative in the world, in Winnicott's notion of transitional objects. It must be doing more, because otherwise we would all be rather mad all the time, rather than just some of the time. And you know, Winnicott, I think, is developing this sense of the imagination as in touch with reality, taking reality on, relating to reality in these much more active ways, rather than just hoping that we can make some accommodation to reality, even though it, you know, continues to frighten us, basically, as Freud, I think, felt. I think you get a similar move in Jung. In the psychotherapy world, people are thinking of Winnicott and Jung as much closer fellows than perhaps they even felt they were in life. I mean, certainly Winnicott didn't, he could write very cuttingly about Jung at times, but I think that Jung's notion of the active imagination is part and parcel of this romanticism come of age. This is perhaps becoming clearer now the Red Book has been published, and people are realizing quite how profoundly important that was to Jung and all that he came up with. Another idea in psychotherapy, which I think relates to this, is the notion of what's sometimes put in rather abstract ways of the third position. And this is the idea that psychotherapy differs from other ways that we try to help people with mental health problems, because we don't just, as it were, sit with the individual and their problem and try to work out ways that the problem can be managed or related to differently, as, say, a more behavioral approach might try to achieve. But we wait for a third position in relation to the individual and the problem to start to show itself, to start to come forward. And that's the third position. It's the space that might revolve around the individual and their challenge. And I think that this is related to a new imaginative possibility in relation to the problem, you know, which increasingly, to my mind, relates to the sense of struggle and suffering that is inevitably involved in this process, and which you get in the mystical traditions, in Christianity. If you can find a way to, through, as it were, the cross, then a whole new life can show up for you. And it's not remotely easy, and it's a very difficult ask. You know, it's one that people must choose, I think, rather than have forced upon them. But nonetheless, this notion of the third position in psychotherapy, I increasingly feel is a way of operationalizing, you might say, turning actually into a path, into a process and a practice that takes on the imagination in this rich and fullest possible sense, so that the problem actually seeds a new creative possibility in life. It becomes, it takes on the war between the harp and the camera, and turns it into a new relationship between the harp and the camera, to refer to Barfield's comments there in the essay. Just the final slide to draw the thoughts to, my thoughts to a conclusion, which might be helpful, I hope, as well, to expand this in a different way. Yeah, and show from the current slide. You know, here's Coleridge's famous remark: "The primary imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception, as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation, the infinite I am." So, you know, as a psychotherapist, I realize that I hear this and say, when through the psychotherapeutic process, the individual can become more than they thought they were. That lovely remark that Gareth suggested there about how the word is itself because it's more than itself, and how the human becomes themselves when they're more than themselves. I think psychotherapy is involved in that process. You know, the small self that, as it were, the individual presented with their struggles becomes the much more than themselves than they ever thought possibly would be possible because of the process that they engage in. And I think Barfield thought about this also in relation to Rudolf Steiner's notion, which I've summarized here as the imagination initially kind of reaches out. It does project, it does seek to make contact with the world. But what it finds is that, at least on occasion, that returns by a kind of inspiration. Something is breathed in that feels expansive. And then that becomes a new intuition, a new sense, perhaps with the mind's eye, that becomes the new ground from which the individual then is able to live. So it's an expansion of reality. And maybe that process of reaching out, return and expansion is something I increasingly try to use that as a kind of guide to interpret what I think might be going on in the moment. Say when I'm sitting with an individual, or you know, thinking about almost a state of mind which I find myself in day by day. You know, do I feel I'm in a state of mind in society, in culture, with a struggle that's reaching out? Am I in a state of mind where I feel something's been returned, perhaps through a poetic moment, perhaps through the sense, I mean, even in relation to COVID-19, I've wondered whether we've so much celebrated this chap that walked, you know, 100 times up and down his garden, the retired soldier. I forget his name actually rather badly in the moment now, but anyway, yeah, thank you. You know, something was returned when he was doing that in our imaginative reaching out through this crisis. And, you know, if we're lucky, we notice that and can make it a new ground, a new intuition from which to live as we go forward. Now, whether or not that happens in relation to COVID-19, I have no idea. But at least in principle, I think that can happen with individuals and with the calling that I think we feel in the Romantic tradition, maybe even in Christianity. Again, I'm not sure what will happen to Christianity going forward. But I feel fairly convinced that if it is to go forward in this expansive way at all, we need to take notice of these Barfieldian themes and try to work out how they're actually active in our lives now, so that we can choose them, we can turn towards them actively, and not just, as it were, be glad when they pass us by.
Mark, thank you very much for that fascinating talk. I'm reminded of the adage that I understand is written above Jung's house in Küsnacht, vocatus atque non vocatus Deus aderit, so bidden or unbidden, God is present. I was also reminded, I was just reading Shaftesbury the other day in his advice to an author, where he talks about the ancients and their celebrated inscription, "Recognize yourself," which was as much as to say, divide yourself, or be two. For if the division were rightly made, all within would, of course, they thought, be rightly understood and prudently managed. Such confidence they had in this home dialect of soliloquy. For it was accounted the peculiar of philosophers and wise men to be able to hold themselves in talk. Now that very odd notion of the know thyself, the Delphic imperative, of course, as divide yourself or be two, is, I think, interestingly linked to this Barfieldian notion of the relationship between imagination and inspiration. I mean, it's the development of the ancient notion of the daimon, or the daimonion of Socrates. But thank you very much. I learned a great deal from your talk. Gareth, it also seems very odd that not being able to clap, but I suppose online.
We can clap. We can clap.
Okay, let's clap. Excellent. Just a matter of housekeeping, Gareth, because we don't want to lose time for Malcolm. Do we have 5 minutes for some questions for Mark?
We're beginning to do discussion.
Or do we have a discussion afterwards?
Yeah, I mean, Graham, you kindly proposed that maybe we did some questions after, some short questions, and then took it up into discussion. But I know, Malcolm, you might be slightly pressed for time because you've got.
Okay.
I'm slightly. So I should add, by the way, that when you just saw my name, it wasn't that I was listening with devout interest to Mark's paper, but because during what's your lunch break, I actually have to have a chapel committee meeting.
Oh, sorry. Yep.
I needed to eat, so I thought it might be distracting watching me eat, so I didn't turn it off, but I was present to it. I don't mind whether you do some short questions now, or whether perhaps I give my paper and then we deal with them both together, whichever seems best.
Well, look, I think while we've got, if you don't mind, Malcolm, while we've got Mark's paper in our minds, if we can have a few quick questions.
Yeah.
You mentioned at the beginning, Mark, Shelley's comment that we were surrounded by a power, which I didn't know, which I found very interesting. And then you basically traced the externality of power to an interiority and came up to the Romantics. Now, I wasn't quite sure whether you were saying that the Romantics were returning to an exteriority, as in Shelley's remark, or not. But of course, the traditional view of the Romantics is they're virtually solipsistic and so forth. But my view would be that the words we are all using today, like reason, imagination, and in Wordsworth's case, nature, are all powers that can be looked on as external, to which we have to belong, that we have to make an act in order to belong to that power, which is both us and greater than us. Does that tie in with what you were saying?
Yes, I think so. I mean, there'd be people that know the Romantics better than me here, but my sense certainly is that we receive but what we give and all that. And this seems to be the new imperative. In Barfield's conception, this is a cyclical process or a U process where these, in every alienation, there's a deepening of active involvement that leads to the return. So I think that certainly something like Wordsworth, my sense, which isn't very sophisticated, but is that, he and Blake actually kept the sense of the power around us alive. And certainly in Blake's sense, actually, really worked out how to re-engage with that as something that could be related to from within ourselves as well. Yeah, and then, but then this conjoining, I think, so important. So I'm not sure that Wordsworth completely got that. I think Coleridge understood this because of his notion about incarnation. I think Blake's state of Eden eternity, actually, that's precisely what he was calling for, was actually a commingling, to use a Blakean phrase, which we're actually called towards.
Thank you. Gareth.
If I may, yeah, I mean, it's a good point, Graham. And I mean, Barfield frequently refers to the idea of an inner origin of outward forms. It's a much repeated phrase in different sorts of variations. And he also points out importantly, towards the end of the Harp and the Camera essay, a remark from Coleridge, actually, that if I'm not mistaken, that the mind is not wholly an Aeolian harp.
No.
So there is this sort of sense that yes, there is a sort of power that calls, but that has to be actively participated in, but which nevertheless is a sort of ground of one's ability to participate, so to speak. And on this hinges, I think, his reading of Coleridge's ideas around polarity and unity and multeity and so on.
Yeah. Active is the key word there.
Yeah.
Great. Well, if we haven't got any other questions, then I think it's a good moment to move on to Malcolm.
Okay, right. Well, thank you very much. I'm just going to really comment on the Harp and the Camera essay, but then relate it to wider things, both in Coleridge and in the way that Barfield has written about Coleridge. I think I gave The Shaping Spirit of the Imagination Barfield's reading of Coleridge as a sort of a title. So can you all hear me clearly?
Yep.
Right. So what I'd like to do is just to comment on the fact that Barfield has a fruitful engagement with Coleridge throughout his writing. I mean, from History in English Words onwards, and not only with Coleridge, but because Barfield, both in reading Goethe himself, but also reading Goethe through Steiner and traveling to Germany and going to reading the Transcendental Philosophies, is already au fait with the stream of ideas within which Coleridge is articulating something particular. So, so you always find this interpatterning of Barfield and Coleridge. And Barfield, I think, is also responsible for bringing Coleridge alive in new ways to the rest of the Inklings. I mean, they read Coleridge themselves, but they all said that once they'd really encountered Barfield's ideas, they read texts they thought they knew in new ways. That was certainly my experience when I came eventually to read Barfield's What Coleridge Thought. So anyway, just to look at this short essay, which is in a sense a sort of text amongst us for here, you can see in this short essay how Coleridge is at once a touchstone for Barfield and a sort of interlocutor. So I thought we'd just look at what I regard as three key Coleridgean moments in this essay. Two of them are very obvious ones near the beginning and the end, where Coleridge is directly quoted. But I think there's a third, a much more subtle, but even in my view, more vital Coleridgean moment in this essay, which really comes just in a little turn of phrase, a nice almost epigraph of Barfield's, but which implies and I think summons up a central Coleridgean doctrine. So those are the three things I want to deal with, and I'll deal with them in turn. So obviously,
if I may interrupt, to say that I've just seen that we have a new visitor, and that's Jacob Sherman.
Oh, great! Oh, it'd be good to have him on board.
From California. It's very early for Jacob, but
is Jacob there? Okay, well, I greet Jacob. He and I were in a Barfield reading group together in Cambridge in an earlier incarnation. So we get this this passage. First of all, from the Aeolian Harp, which a direct citation from Coleridge, which is very apt for Barfield because it absolutely clarifies the purely harp-like thing he wants to say about the nature of inspiration and about the inspired person as in some sense being the passive recipient of the inspiration coming through. But I think, and of course later on he nuances and he shows that that's only one side of what Coleridge needs to say, and he rather sharply quotes Coleridge later saying, the mind is not simply an alien help. I thought it might be helpful just to give us a little bit of wider context. He starts the quotation in the Barfield essay with, and what if all of animated nature. Let me just give you a line or two before, and then talk a little bit about what else, even in that early poem, Coleridge does. So actually, just to go a couple of lines before, Coleridge is, the whole poem is addressed to Sarah Coleridge, and is when they're their first sort of attempt at living ideal hippie cottage life together, and they're at Clevedon at this point, not Netherstory. So Coleridge says, 2 lines before the quotation, "For many a thought, uncalled and undetained, and many idle flitting fantasies traverse my indolent and passive brain, as wild and various as the random gales that swell and flutter on this subject lute. And what if all of animated nature be but organic harps, diversely framed that tremble into thought, as o'er them sweeps plastic and vast one intellectual breeze, at once the soul of each and God of all." So it's a quite light touch to begin with. And in fact, he says the thing that's sweeping through him, for it doesn't rather live up to the billing of a vast intellectual breeze. It's actually, he says, idle flitting fantasies. And of course, later on, when in his mature thought, Coleridge makes a very strong distinction between a primary and primal imagination, even a secondary imagination, and fancy. So that's the first thing. There's a bit of a preamble to this which doesn't weight or load the speculation too heavily. And the speculation is simply a speculation. It's, what if? That's an interesting thought. Perhaps all of us are being inspired and blowed upon and making the sound of who we are, and the perceiving things in the way we perceive them, simply because this is passing through us, this world soul, as it were, breathing into us. Anyway, as you may know, the poem then goes on to imagine a rebuke from the more Christianly orthodox Sarah to Coleridge for even having asked this open question. But thy more serious eye a mild reproof darts, O beloved woman. And he calls her a meek daughter in the family of Christ. But he kind of accepts the rebuke, and he says something which in a way is quite prophetic towards the end of the poem. He says, "For never guiltless may I speak of him, the incomprehensible, save when with awe I praise him, and with faith that inly feels, who with his saving mercies healed me." So there's a part of him that notices what Barfield would call, or still feels what Barfield would call, original participation. But there's another part of him that resonates with and wants to give an account of, what we would later call the I-thou relationship. So even in this early apparent expression of a completely sort of pantheistic all harp moment, there is a kind of reservation and a counterweight to which Coleridge returns more seriously and powerfully, both in his later thinking in prose and his later feeling and intuiting and indeed thinking in poetry. So then, as we've already noticed, at the end of his essay, having allowed Coleridge to make the point at one stage of the harp camera conversation, he then brings Coleridge in as somebody who is equally aware of the camera obscura, equally aware of that whole Renaissance development, but who, because he's Coleridge, is able to read it through a pre-modern, more participative way as well, because he's completely familiar with Plotinus. And it's very interesting that that Barfield quotes Coleridge quoting Plotinus. Plotinus is really important throughout for Coleridge. I mean, there's a whole lot of work to be done, some of which already has been done, about how deeply imbued with not simply the Platonic, but the Neoplatonic fields of thought Coleridge is. But actually, Charles Lamb tells us that Coleridge, as a schoolboy, was quoting Plotinus in Greek at Christ's Hospital. So it goes very deep with him. So Barfield brings in Coleridge at the end, and particularly with this idea of the sun, and that, as it were, what should be doing the projection in the camera obscura of the mind is not simply the mind itself projecting out in our modern psychological sense, but something which is participative of the sun. The sun, of course, is also Apollo. And there's a huge, by the time Coleridge comes to write that comment in prose about the camera obscura and the sun, he's written The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and developed a profoundly Platonic reading of the sun and the moon, whereby the sun represents, as it were, the direct intuition of knowledge from the pure realm of the unimpeded and, in a sense, unimaged true, good, and beautiful. And the moon represents those things mediated to us by the reflection of the apparent images, the phenomena around us. So we need something of that primal sun. So those are the two bookends, as it were, of Coleridge in this essay. But what interested me most in rereading it, I mean, lots of things interested me in rereading it, one of which was what an extraordinary prophetic essay it is. When you think that this was written, I think, in the late 60s or early 70s, it's delivered at Wheaton College. It's got that nice, timely reference to the guitar-loving hippies, of whom, of course, I am an aged version of one. But it also, it talks about our photographic culture, our camera culture. It already begins to lament that people aren't actually sort of participatively engaging in the to and fro of what's there, but merely recording in an artificial perspective and framing. They're having camera holidays. And goodness me, if you think of everybody holding their iPhones up and reducing the world, as it were, to the projection of the screen, then Barfield was really onto something. But, and there's a kind of strange irony, isn't it, whereby we ourselves are, we are all trapped in tiny little chambers of an intricate camera obscura in which we sadly see nothing but these reflective surfaces, something about which I've just recently written a poem. Anyway, in the middle of the essay comes, I think, a wonderful epigram, really, that would stand alone in a dictionary of quotations from Barfield. The single sentence, "Imagination is living, perspective only lifelike." That's a great, you know, utterance. Imagination is living, perspective only lifelike. But the reason why I think it's completely Coleridgean is the word living. Living is a really crucial Coleridgean word. The contrast between the organic way of writing, which is living, and the mechanic, which has nothing but fixities and definites. But of course, most crucially, in the great definition of imagination in the fragmentary 13th chapter of the Biographia Literaria, to which Mark has already alluded, the imagination then I consider either as primary or secondary. The primary imagination I hold to be the living power. Living is where this is where the living, you know, imagination is living, perspective is only lifelike, is coming from. Imagination, says Coleridge, is the living power and prime agent of all human perception. All human perception. So every act of perceiving involves the living power, and also really the other crucial word there is agent, the agency of the imagination. The whole of Coleridge's philosophy subsequent to this insight is built on recognizing the active as well as the passive in the nature of human perception. You could say the Aeolian harp is at one end, at the passive end. And in a sense, he has to overcompensate, and eventually he comes up with a synthesis. So imagination is the living power and prime agent of all human perception. And of course, he then goes on theologically to root and ground that in a whole doctrine of the Logos and the eternal creation by Christ, and a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. But we're perhaps not going there on this occasion. So the agency is important. And what I think Barfield is doing through the two, in this essay, through the two emblems of the harp and the camera, is animating for us this apparent tension and conflict between perception and participation as passive, that is to say, the harp, which is the in some sense corresponds to Barfield's leading idea of original participation, going back to the Homeric world. And this period through which we pass and are passing now of distance, separation, fixity, the separation of the little camera obscura into which the things fall, and the consequent dangers of projection. But we are then going to pass through that, says Barfield, eventually, if we will, into a kind of new consciousness, which will, he calls final participation, and in which we will lose nothing of the particular perspective, to use that loaded word, that our individual life gives us and our active choices give us, but nevertheless return to some wider participation of which the harp is an emblem, hence the little harp, Apollo's harp, strung as it were across the aperture of the camera. Now, interestingly, when you go, as well as rereading this essay, I also returned with great pleasure, although it certainly wakes the mind up, to what Coleridge thought. The great book of Barfield, late Barfield book in the 70s, in which he does Coleridge the immense honor of saying, let's not treat him either biographically and just say, oh, what was going on in Coleridge's life when he wrote this, as though they were a sort of reductive biographical explanation for everything. Nor does he treat him as many Coleridge scholars have done, as being part of a general history of ideas and really just try and sort of locate him in other people's streams of thought and then accuse him of not sufficiently footnoting his contributions. But rather trying to see the wholeness of what Coleridge was saying. And Barfield comes to the conclusion, and I think demonstrates, incontrovertibly, in this book, that there is a system, that Coleridge was right in saying he had a system of thought, what he called the dynamic and communicative philosophy. Now, what happens, interestingly, when I reread the two chapters on imagination and fancy, but I reread them, as it were, in light of the harp and the camera essay, with its desire both to distinguish, and Coleridge famously said it's the philosopher's privilege to distinguish but not to divide. So the desire of Barfield to distinguish between the harp and the camera, but not to divide them in the end. So very interestingly, right at the heart of the second chapter on imagination and fancy in the Barfield book on Coleridge, he quotes the great passage about the water boatman, the little beetle on the surface of the water, in which Coleridge finds an emblem for the mind. And this is Barfield quoting Coleridge, but Barfield prefaces it by saying that he's going to do his own emphasis. So here we have in the italics, and you can't, a Barfieldian reading of Coleridge, which is at the core of what I want to say. So he says, let us place one of these the earlier passages of Coleridge alongside this passage in Biographia Literaria, taking the liberty to italicize in order to bring out the point now being made. So here's what he quotes. Now, this is Coleridge now. Let a man watch his mind while he is composing. Most of my readers will have observed a small water insect on the surface of the rivulets, and will have noticed how the little animal wins its way up against the stream by alternate pulses of active and passive motion, now resisting the current, now yielding to it. Alternate pulses of active and passive motion is Barfield's italics. Barfield's underlining. It's that alternate pulsing of the active and passive which leaps out to Barfield and upon which his mind seizes. Now resisting, now yielding in order to get further strength. And a momentary fulcrum, which is Coleridge's italics, for a further propulsion. Then Barfield goes on to say, this is Barfield interpreting, the point here is not merely that imagination is an interplay between active and passive elements in the relationship between man and nature, but also the further fact that that interplay may be consciously experienced. There you are, there's a kind of echo of the great phrase in Poetic Diction, where he says that poetry is a felt change of consciousness. Interestingly, in fact, the word felt was inserted into that text at that point by C.S. Lewis. He was reading it to Lewis and Lewis was talking about it. And it was Lewis who said, you've really got to emphasize the aha moment, that moment when you can feel the shift and you become aware of a new way of participating in the world, your mode and possibility of consciousness, rather than your mere access to facts. It has actually been altered by the experience of the poetry. So the water insect, Coleridge continues, and here's Barfield continuing his quotation, is no unapt emblem of the mind's self-experience in the act of thinking. There are evidently two powers at work, which relatively to each other are active and passive. And this is not possible without an intermediate faculty, which is at once both active and passive. In philosophical language, we must denominate this intermediate faculty in all its degrees and determinations, the imagination. So that Barfieldian emphasis on the imagination as precisely, well, actually, not even more than just the reconciler, but as it were, the polar dynamic. So we have in the harp and the camera, we have this distinction and apparent conflict between the harp and the camera, between inspiration and projection, between the passive and the active in the modes of our knowing and perceiving. And what I think Coleridge does, and I think this may be developed by Gareth and others later, is to see not an opposition, not a mere distinction, not even a reluctant reconciliation, but a polar dynamic constantly at play. And I think it is that dynamic ultimately that Barfield, as it were, prophetically is looking forward to us enjoying in and as a mode of final participation becomes available to us. I think later on when he quotes, having quoted Coleridge at the end, he uses a phrase, possibly echoing Blake, but he talks about the need, this is Barfield's call to us at the end of the essay, for a true marriage, that's the phrase he uses, between the two great symbols, and suggests that it's the harp stretched across the window of the eye. And Barfield doesn't actually draw this out, but it's a very beautiful thing that's there in the kind of patterning of his essay, that he tells us in a classically Barfieldian way, where all the wisdom of Barfield comes out of his philology and his history of words. And often he'll just tell you that there's a word that's got a double meaning or an earlier meaning, and then he suddenly shows you what it is. So just at the beginning of the essay, he mentions casually that etymologically window is actually a development of wind-eye, that it is both that which admits light and that which admits the wind. And then he says, can we have a little harp, as it were, across the aperture of the camera consciousness? And of course, he's simply asking that it should be a window in the sense that the very word window requires both the harp and the camera to be what it is. It requires both the breath of inspiration and, as it were, the perspective and light and projection, which allows us individual space in the flux and being in the flux of the world. Now, I know we've already been running late, but I wondered if I might actually conclude what I have to say, or just, you know, if I might give scholarship the kiss of life with a verse, as Seamus Heaney once said. And there's, no, have I got it? There are two things I just think might be of interest to us. One is a version by the contemporary poet Don Paterson of one of Rilke's sonnets to Orpheus. Obviously, Rilke is himself working in this same tradition that's followed on from Goethe and others. And he has something to say about breath. There's a simple poem about breath, which just seemed to me to celebrate all that the harp is and all that original participation is, and the way breath from outside becomes inside and inside becomes outside, and that exchange physically in breath. But also, I don't know, I read it afresh in the light of this harp and camera essay. So I thought I'd read it to you. And the other thing I thought I would read to you more as a sort of lighter touch is a recent poem of my own about the problem of image and imaging on the very thing we're doing right now, which is a Zoom conference. So perhaps I can leave you with these two things, and we can develop them from there. So this is Don Paterson's version of Rilke's sonnet, Breath. Breath, you invisible poem, pure exchange, sister to silence, being and its counterbalance, rhythm wherein I become, ocean I accumulate by stealth, by the same slow wave, thriftiest of seas, thief of the whole cosmos. What estates, what vast spaces have already poured through my lungs. The four winds are like daughters to me. So, do you know me, air that once sailed through me? You that were once the leaf and rind of my every word. It's just wonderful, the words themselves, but particularly those phrases, pure exchange, being and its counterbalance, rhythm wherein I become. Those seem to me to be phrases that, of which we might avail ourselves in the development of these ideas. And on a lighter note, but since we are Zooming a great deal, and I shall have to Zoom elsewhere, unfortunately, shortly, I mentioned at the beginning, there is an irony about the nature of this encounter, given our subject matter, in that the danger is that it's all camera and no harp, though maybe we can become the harp in other ways. So I've just completed a series called Quarantine Quatrains, of which, as the word quarantine might suggest, there are 40, but I'm not going to read all 40. I'm going to read you 5 quatrains, which are about this experience we're all having, and maybe they'll offer something to some of the difficulties that we have. So, some days I am diverted by a call, the soft computer chime that summons all to show a face to faces that we meet, mirages, empty mirrors on the wall. Alas, that all the friends we ever knew, whose lives were fragrant and whose touch was true, can only meet us on some little screen, then zoom away with scarcely an adieu. We share with them the little that we know, these galleries of ghosts set in a row. They flicker on the screen of life a while, but some have left the meeting long ago. We used to stroll together on the green, who now divide the squares upon the screen. The faces of our friends so far apart tease us with tenderness that might have been. Someday we'll break the bread, we'll pour the wine, and meet and kiss and feast beneath the vine. Till then we'll sweeten solitude with verse and yearn through pain and watch each day decline. Perhaps there's an analogy between the flatness of the Zoom meeting now and the possibility of a serious symposium in the full sense of that word and real participation. There's an analogy between the flat screen and our current alienated way of knowing and the fuller way of knowing, which Barfield says is in store for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, thank you, Malcolm, for that inspirational talk. We've got, I think, about a quarter of an hour. Is that right, Malcolm?
Yeah, I have to be in another meeting for which I should at least pretend to be prepared. But anyway, yeah. So I'm probably going to have to sign off at about 1 to 2 just to get my act together in the other room.
Yeah, great. So questions?
Douglas, a lot of people are on mute. Mark's on mute. Jacob's on mute.
Okay.
That's
so
just what they're listening.
Could you come off mute, everybody?
Maria's on mute.
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't mean that I cannot hear.
Oh, yeah, but we want to hear you.
Yes, yes.
Too.
Well, probably I will not be the first. It's not so easy to reflect and to speak at the same time. You see, well, probably I will need several minutes just to think it over, and then I will come out.
Okay, that's fine, Maria. Yeah. Has anybody got an immediate question for our speakers, particularly Malcolm in the first instance?
Sure. I want to say, first of all, thank you, Dr. Guite. I really loved your talk, especially in the relationship to poetry. I have your book, Faith, Hope, and Poetry here, which I've been enjoying tremendously. And you mentioned Orpheus, and elsewhere you've mentioned that you've been wanting to put on a staging of Orpheus. I just want to ask whether that's ever happened, or if you've ventured recently into Barfield's the world of his imaginative works.
The staging hasn't happened, but I think it should. This is Barfield's, for everyone, this is Barfield's play, Orpheus, which actually really moved C.S. Lewis, and which I think is an astonishing piece of work. So I haven't done that, but I have been reading Barfield's own little marker note, and happily Owen Barfield Jr., as it were, the grandson, has let me have some of those. And I think the two of those that strike me as being extraordinarily prophetic and speaking into our moment are Eager Spring, which speaks into the whole ecological crisis. But to be honest, if you want a new lockdown book, if you want a sense about the zeitgeist at the moment and the fear of contamination and all that stuff, read Night Operation. My goodness, there's a dystopian fiction set in a world where they're terrified of airborne infection and they've all gone hunkering down into little undergrounds and lost it. Of course, that book is a beautiful retelling of the story in Plato, the myth of Plato's cave. It's Plato's cave as dystopic science fiction, magnificent. Just as the Silver Chair is Plato's cave as children's story. So yeah, I know. I thank you for reminding me of that. Whether we'll ever get to the days in Cambridge where you can sort of magically summon up a troop of students and produce such a thing, I don't know, but somebody should certainly do it. I think I may be passing that director's baton down to your generation rather than mine.
Just to say, it has been performed once in Sheffield shortly after it was written, and about 6 years ago in Los Angeles, California.
Oh, wow.
Well, I can say about the Night Operation. We had a session of a meeting of all our participants about the Night Operation. We could not stop. We had another one because this is not only Platonic. There is not only Platonic stream there. There is a very clear Arthurian stream.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yes, it is clearly Arthurian stream, and the more so, the names of the three main characters there are John, Jack, and Pete. And that's not for the first time that we meet three names together.
Yeah.
Just think of it, John.
Oh, absolutely. Though I think they're also in a sense ciphers for some of the Inklings. No, I agree with you. Of course it's a book. It's Platonic, but it's also a book about Arthurian vision. It's about the vision of the Grail.
Absolutely. So I think this is the most needed book right now, well, all books by Barfield can be read now, but Night Operation is just for this time of quarantine, when you sit at home and read Night Operation. And I must tell you that this, this idea by Barfield of bringing together the inspiration and the clear self-consciousness, it appears already in the very beginning in poetic diction. You can read in several chapters, you can read about this bringing together more and more as time goes on. Those two streams go together, and he speaks about the moment when a poet, a real poet, this is the task of the poet, to bring those two streams together. And it is going on already, but in the future, it will be much more visible. And compared with Barfield's time, we are in this future already. So just for the last month, you can feel that this future, I don't know how the quotation goes in English, the times are coming, and they have come already. Well, I unfortunately, I don't know them in English. It's from the Gospels, the time is coming, and it has come already. So we are already in this time. You can feel it very clearly. And I must say that the ideas and the words by Barfield, it really helps. And when I share it with people, and it's a good task, and it's a good work, really.
Thank you.
I'd like to add, if I may, just a couple of quotations of interest, which connect to a few points that you mentioned, Malcolm, and which again point, I think, to some of the depth of that Harp and Camera essay. Particularly, first of all, in reference to your discussion of the emblematic, and also to the Coleridgean themes of life, natura naturans, that he talks about in the Coleridge book. And the first of those is from Girton, and I think this connects to a much broader and more interesting discussion around the sort of Girtian relation of Barfield and Coleridge's understanding of science and the nature of participation. And the quotation from Girton is, reason with its tendency towards the divine has only to do with becoming the living, understanding with the become the already fixed, that it may make use of it. And then the other is from Emerson, who, of course, Barfield variously refers to, and his essay on language, which is in the first book of collected essays in the first volume of Nature. It is not only words that are emblematic, it is things which are emblematic. Every natural fact is a symbol of some spiritual fact. And I just suppose those two things speak to a couple of the other themes that you raised there, connected to, as I say, the depth of that essay and the broader ideas it relates to.
Yes, I mean, the notion of things, well, both as words as things and things themselves as words is really crucial. I had a passage, I mean, I realized that wasn't going to be time, so I omitted from my paper a parallel. I had a passage which was a sort of a reading in conversation between what he says in Frost at Midnight on the one hand, and in Dejection and Ode another, where in Frost at Midnight, he, in a rather uncomplicated way, sees the appearances, the phenomena, as the lovely shapes and sounds intelligible of that eternal language which thy God utters, who doth teach himself in all things in himself. So you just receive that, you passively receive it, the shaping's already been done for you. And then almost the opposite thing that he says in Dejection and Ode, where, you know, O lady, we receive but what we give, you know, and in our life alone does nature live, from the soul must issue that fair luminous cloud, and so on. And really the rest of his life is working out how both of those things can be true at the same time. And the answer is, of course, that the shaping imagination, the luminous cloud that goes out, is itself made in the image of the maker. It is a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation. And so the two meet participatively and, as it were, the cosmos can't quite be there in the sense that we think it's there, in the sense that a poem isn't there when it's flat between the pages of a book. It has to shimmer into being. The text is the veil between which the poet, the mind of the poet and the mind of the reader meet and become the poem. But the minds of both have to be equally active in their imagination and at the same moment for the poem as itself, as it were, to shimmer into being. And I think that's Coleridge, how Coleridge felt the whole cosmos was. That's why he talks about but of course the sun is in us. So at the very end of the Biographia, he has that extraordinary thing about the exchange, a beautiful eternal exchange between the Father and the Son, which of course is the Spirit, and just says, who's this exchange of song between the Father and the Son? He says, whose choral echo is the universe? You know, one of the best sentences ever.
If I could just interject, I mean, this is just like a little footnote to that. The notion of Shakespeare in relation to this conception of genius, that the emphasis in Coleridge, if I remember that correctly, is very much on the aspect of control. So
well,
rather,
it's both.
Sorry?
I think it's both. I mean,
yes, yes. Well, I mean the combination, the dialectical relationship between inspiration and control.
I mean, he specifically says about Shakespeare that Shakespeare was consciously directing a power and implicit wisdom deeper than consciousness.
Yes. Mm.
So it's both and. I'm afraid I'm going to have to sign off. I'm sorry about this.
Excellent, but thank you so much.
I have to do a committee meeting, and
yes.
I'll try and tune in again after that when I've recovered from it sufficiently. But it's the nearest I get to any kind of line management or supervision, so I really can't drive it off.
Thanks, Malcolm.
Okay, I'm. See you.
Bye. Excellent. Well, any more sort of general questions, and perhaps any more questions for Mark?
I was going to make a point. Well, Malcolm's gone, but he talked about the phrase from Barfield, the felt change, poetry is the felt change of consciousness. Mm. And that did remind me of just how important feeling is in the two poems I've been looking at closely recently, the Immortality Ode and Dejection. What Wordsworth wants to see is, if you like, the world as it is, but completely revitalized by some power within. And the only way of expressing the difference in the seen world is through feeling. So Coleridge sums it up in his Dejection because he's responding to Wordsworth's first 4 stanzas. I see, not feel how beautiful they are. So then all knowledge, it seems to reside, or all experience, in feeling only, which is a rather risky place to leave it, I always think.
Yeah, I think that speaks to a very interesting tension between, I suppose, sort of sensuous and noetic intuition, one could say, and I think particularly around a lot of the debates in German idealism, following Kant, around the nature of the aesthetic.
There's also, by the way, if I could say that there's the phrase in Plotinus of the nous eron, the loving intellect. So there's a stress in Plotinus on the affective dimension of the intellect, which of course goes back to the Symposium and the Phaedrus and the whole Platonic theory of sublimated love. So it's I think this stress upon the combination of feeling and reason is yes, has its own tradition, and I think makes perfect sense. There is a kind of deracinated.
But you're really saying, Douglas, you're saying feeling is knowledge.
Well, what I'd be saying is that on this model, episteme, knowledge, is, I mean, obviously, speaking rather globally, a particular combination of insight, but it's felt insight. Yeah. So anyway, one would have to.
But the difficulty is representing that in poetry, isn't it? How do you represent a felt state over a perceived state? It's not actually that straightforward.
Well, I think it makes perfect sense if you think about the philosophical opposition. So if you think about a figure like Bentham or Kant, I mean, the whole positivistic tradition, I mean, the philosophical mistake that they have made, according to this, I'd say, romantic Barfieldian tradition, is that they have an inadequate conception of reason, a conception of reason that will not, as Aristotle says, save the appearances. And what are you going to, how are you going to construct an adequate concept of reason? Well, it's one that does justice to the phenomena, and that must have an effective component to it. I think that's how the story should run. So I don't think it's feeling against reason. I think it's
I agree entirely, and I hope it will come. I hope it will be apparent later this afternoon.
Yeah, yeah. Do we have? I know we're coming up to the period for our break, and I'm conscious that these Zoom meetings can be more exhausting than meetings in the flesh. So they certainly are for me. So do we have a final question before we break off?
I did want to just say, not so much a question, but just to support Mark's final slide that he put up there, which was the imagination, inspiration, intuition slide, which I was very taken by. I thought he's really onto something, and the way Mark said he actually applies that in his life, I thought was really interesting and gives us a lot to think about and maybe to develop further as well. But I think you're really onto something there.
Mm. Maybe just another thought, which I think relates to that actually, is that, Douglas, when you quoted the third Earl of Shaftesbury there, it made me think about his notion of Bildung, and how Bildung maybe fits into all that we're talking about, because that's about an education that's about learning to resonate with what's going on rather than just receive, as it were, like, as Plato put it, like emptying water out of a jug into a glass. So that much richer notion of education feels like it's on the periphery of our discussion as well.
Well, I think this is also why the present moment is very worrying for the future of universities, because I think in the wake of this crisis, you will have all kinds of reformers saying, well, let's do more of this. If we can teach by Zoom, then we can have all these online courses, we can cut our costs, we can, revise the absurd institutions of tutorials and supervisions, which I think any of us who have known the supervision or tutorial system at its best will know that there's a transformative dimension to it, an element of paideia, which is, or Bildung, which is precisely because it isn't just the transmission of facts or the communication of knowledge, but is knowledge felt. It's the spark of learning that can be transformative. And in fact, I wonder whether there's, given your own profession, Mark, whether there's an analogy here with the therapist, that the power of simply being in the room with another person, that is well, an element of participation here that is an integral element of the Barfieldian project. And at the moment, I think we're in danger of maybe, well, there's a potentially perilous dimension, I think, to the crisis at the moment, and what may be drawn as a positive result of this Zoom activity.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge discussion going on about therapy online and all that and what it does. I mean, there's much could be said, but one thought actually that comes to my mind is the element of ritual in all this as well, and how invocation and ritual, which prepares us, which is another element of our active engagement with something.
Yes.
And certainly, you know, one of the things which I've noticed as in therapy we've gone online is that the ritual of coming to the therapy room gets called sort of thin right out, because people just sit down with their phone. There was actually an article in the New York Times this morning saying sit down with their phone on the toilet when they're coming to therapy. I'm not sure I've had that myself. But anyway, it may be because people live in small flats. But nonetheless, the point about the whole process of coming to therapy as a kind of ritual performance that readies the mind to receive something. And I guess, you know, the ritual of the tutorial and so on, that's quite heavy duty when you're going through it. So yeah, maybe there's a lot in that element as much as anything else.
Excellent. So we're now recording. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jacob. You've saved the day. Excellent. So now we
can see the sun has risen in California as well. I see now.
Yes, it's actually daylight now.
It's looking light in the background. Yeah.
Okay, that's wonderful. So let us resume with our program, which I just have to find. So our next speaker, sorry, forgive me, I've lost the program. Our next speaker.
It's my presentation.
It's Gareth. So Gareth, if you could begin, please.
Yeah, thank you. Well, obviously, thank you so much for hearing my introductory remarks earlier as well. And I'll probably elaborate on a few of those points. And also, I think, add to Malcolm's wonderful paper as well, and open up some of the other questions around polarity as it relates to the harp and the camera. So I think as we've begun to discuss, the nature of inspiration and the creative logos is deeply considered in Owen Barfield's writings on the legacy of romantic thought, the reciprocity of the infinite and the finite in participatory consciousness, and the spiritual rediscovery of meaning. Barfield's thought from his earliest writings on poetry and Coleridge to his later on participation explore a crucial interconnection that is to be rediscovered in the potentiality of the imagination. The meeting of the harp and the camera is part of a philosophy of imagination that unites the rational and the poetical to a new form of dynamic polarity between the human and the divine, a form of poetic experience that reconciles the projective adaptations of the evolution of consciousness and the modern sense of self-understanding with the transcendent meaning conveyed in inspiration and the felt change of consciousness in poetic diction. In the harp and the camera, Barfield employs the contrasting significance of the harp and the camera as representative of an historical shift in the evolution of consciousness, the nature of participation and the imagination. And in many ways, this contrast is dialectically representative of the themes explored in much of Barfield's work and to its Coleridgean and Neoplatonic influences. The harp is a symbol of inspiration. It indicates the original unity and reciprocity of the soul and the world, a unity lost in the detachment brought about by the self-alienation of spirit and nature. The camera symbolizes a sense of detachment. It's a form of projection that he says always looks at and never into what it sees. It is a caricature of imagination, he says, indicating a distinct loss of meaning in which projective abilities, those that have moved towards a changed relation of interiority and exteriority, of subject and object, have moved in the direction of nothingness, rather than in the active participatory role of the imagination. The emphasis upon the nature of the camera's distance and perspective has caused, Barfield says, the loss, for the time being, of that felt union with the inner origin of outward forms, which constitutes perception of their meaning. And so the harp symbolizes the soul's reciprocity with nature, while the camera projects, rather than imitates, creating a one-sidedness to the self-understanding of phenomena and of the self, in establishing an outside, appearances in which the mind plays no active role. Imagination is living, says Barfield, perspective only lifelike. But whilst this difference indicates the direction that the camera sequence has taken in the evolution of consciousness, this must be crucially understood in the emergence of the significance of metaphor and poetry and the significance of meaning. Poetry imparts wisdom only by its life, its movement, says Barfield, and this life is the movement of the imagination in the discovery of meaning. If it were not for the poetic or prophetic character, wrote Blake, the philosophic and experimental would soon be at the ratio of all things and stand still, unable to do other than repeat the same dull round over again. But such significance of poetic diction emerges historically, and as Barfield variously emphasises, with great historical significance in the language of the Gospels and the life of Jesus, the Word incarnated, is a means to understand the way to a form of participatory relation with the creative logos. The contexts of Barfield's Coleridgean philosophies of the imagination and the word are deeply related to the prologue of St. John's Gospel, and that the idea of polarity is both the basic act of imagination and the ground, he says in a Coleridgean way, of all distinctities in the relation of the human and the divine, is a revelation of the historical significance of the incarnation. This could be related to Barfield's question, in what way is imagination true? And it's to the essence of this question, to its implications for the nature of meaning, the role of inspiration and of the imagination, that the relation of Coleridge and Barfield inform deep reflections of the importance of the imagination in relation to nature, and of the recollection of that forgetting of what he calls the common origin of inner and outer worlds. And if we recall the Gospel, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and that in him was life, and the life was the light of men, that the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. One finds in Blake's visionary imagination that tension of light and darkness, of meaning and inspiration, of a dark and unknown night, indefinite, immeasurable, without end, abstract philosophy warring in enmity against imagination. Barfield's attendance to language is a discovery of how that light is renewed in the creative incarnation of meaning in words, words whose histories exhibit the meaning of the past. The full meanings of words are flashing iridescent shapes like flames, says Barfield, ever flickering vestiges of the slowly evolving consciousness beneath them. The rediscovery of meaning for Barfield and his understanding of the interpenetration of meaning with Jesus's words as life and light, of being, is therefore closely connected to the idea of disenchantment and desacralization in consciousness that has attenuated a connection with the divine. The long development of the camera sequence that Barfield discusses, the nature of the consciousness of the projective, is connected with the historical emergence of poetry alongside myth. As soon, Barfield writes, as signature was added to and interwoven with archetype in the substance and structure of myth. And thus the development of the camera sequence, the means by which the thought of subject and object has emerged as a negative condition of thought, is only emphasized, misdirected as it were, but not necessitated. The distinction between inner and outer, which seems so fundamental to us, writes Barfield, will be seen to have been brought about by man himself in the very process of exercising the symbolizing faculty which gave him his language. In consequence, a poetical principle and the emergence of a rekindled imaginative spirit, embodied in romantic thought, for instance, emerges as a means to again reconnect to that original unity, and thus a philosophy of the imagination. The attendance to the inspired form of language becomes a key direction of the journey back to a rediscovery of meaning. The predominance of projection over inspiration presents a choice between a projection of nothingness or a projection of light, a projection in which the imagination is absent or in which it is living. It is in a newly animated sense of the power of the imagination, what Barfield calls a true marriage between the harp and the camera, that he creates a dialectic of metaphors and images, of the choice of images with which to understand modernity and meaning, in which one can see meaning in the creative relation of inspiration and imagination, or from a withdrawal into abstraction. The dialectic of harp and camera, of the sense in which both activity and passivity interrelate experience, is thus seen to be a key to understanding modernity, and this can only be properly understood by reframing the historical development of language and the significance of the word and meaning in the creative logos. It is invariably assumed, Barfield wrote, that whatever the truth may be about the psychological nexus between man and nature, it is an unchanging one, and is the same now as it was when men first appeared on earth. This presupposition is widely challenged in Barfield's work on language and historical thought. The harp and the camera, interwoven in experience, symbolize the tension between historical consciousness and the present, of the meaning imbricated in language, revealed as itself the revelatory source of understanding. For, Barfield writes, language has preserved for us the inner living history of man's soul. It reveals the evolution of consciousness, and this consciousness has its source in the common origin of man's outer and inner worlds. Barfield sees Romanticism and the work of Coleridge as having offered the nearest, yet unfulfilled response to a spiritual need to overcome abstract thought, a view gradually developing that reached a key point of change in Kantianism and has rippled its effects across the range of contemporary thought. The division of subject and object is reimagined in Romantic thought, a poetical theory that approaches a new philosophy to form a new relation with the original unity of inner-outer worlds. This forms much of the focus of Barfield's reflections on Romantic philosophy. The imagination and creative faculties so focused upon at this time symbolize a kind of momentous development where humans partake again in the wonder of imagination that connects with what Barfield calls the music of the turning spheres, of a sort of Neoplatonic image of partaking in beauty and goodness, and Christian images of light and word. Barfield points to Coleridge's writings on logic and to the possibilities of what he calls a poetic or formal science, a thinking whose potentiality has profound implications for the nature of being, nature, and the imagination. And the idea of polarity is Coleridgean, and Barfield writes that the apprehension of polarity is itself the basic act of imagination. For such an act comprehends the generative unity of opposition. They are distinguishable, but not divisible. It was held by Coleridge, Barfield writes, that the human imagination at its highest level does indeed inherit and continue the divine creative activity of the Logos, which was the common origin of human language and consciousness, as well as the world which contains them. The imagination is a creative reanimation of nature, a reconnection, the reciprocity of unity in multiplicity that bespeaks the original relation to the creative Logos, to the sense of the incarnational nature of meaning and the felt change of consciousness in poetic diction. The way in which polarity is the basis both for an understanding of the imagination and of the relation to the divine, and in fact to the sense in which these are only distinctions, not differences, is paralleled in a way that Barfield writes, in Coleridge's logic, one feels the presence of the Logos. The Logos is the word, but it is also that through which all things that have come into being. In contemplating that symbolic reciprocity, that original relation of meaning and creative thought, spirit thinks itself, the divine in nature and the nature of the divine in humanity. As in Emerson's words, that nature is the incarnation of a thought, the world is mind precipitated. Or Wordsworth's, in the mind of man, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of thought, and rolls through all things. Barfield does in fact point to Wordsworth's mention of Aeolian visitations in the prelude. The connection of imagination and appearance are of significant interconnection, are deeply interfused in Wordsworth's terms, in Barfield's thought on Coleridge, and of the nature of the polarity of the human and the divine. These are connections that are intrinsic to understanding the nature of inspiration and the imagery of revelation in nature. Barfield writes that reason is being, but that is another way of saying that reason is God, and indeed the polarity, God-man, is the basis of all polarity in nature and elsewhere. God is the ground of the unity between God and man, but also of the distinction between them, and that distinction is itself the ground of all other distinctities. And this is in his book on what Coleridge taught. It's in this way that what is experienced as actuality is both a presence and absence of the divine, not divided, but a distinction, the one in the many, a unity participated. This is a participation in the Logos, a creative participation, which is a relation of distinctity. The common origin is the coming into being alongside one another of inner and outer worlds, and the word, the spirit is inspiration, fell to the motions of the Aeolian harp, the spirit and eternity of thought, as Wordsworth writes, that give us the forms and images of breath and everlasting motion. For Coleridge, Barfield writes, the whole world of thought, even logic itself, was an organic structure. Reason is super-individual. It is as much an objective as subjective reality. Polarity, the nature of unity and multiplicity, of the whole and the parts, the one and the many, are all closely interconnected, are synonymous in that with the nature of distinctity arises out of spirit self-understanding. The unity that underlies the self is the unity that underlies the whole, Barfield explains of Coleridge. And it's in this relation that we can speak of reason and productive unity, and that the law of polarity is already implicit in the conception of reason as productive unity. Polarity is dynamic, not abstract, writes Barfield, and he cites Coleridge in adding that it's not a mere balance or compromise, but a living and generative interpenetration. Barfield writes of Coleridge's relation to Plotinus, and this alludes to the image not simply as sensuous apprehension, but noetic apprehension. It points to the nature of unity and multiplicity and of participatory consciousness, of the nature of contemplation, and Plotinus's comments on the one as the productive power of all things, poured forth as from a spring. This is also the nature of contemplation. In the imaginative spirit, in the meaning unlocked by poetic metaphor and the illumination of understanding, a deeply contemplative thought is established, moving towards that ultimate object of contemplation, a unity in which thought partakes. Barfield cites the passage from the Enneads quoted by Coleridge that no eye has ever seen the sun without becoming sun-like. And whilst the imagery of poetic diction and of the sensuous imagery that it powerfully evokes are rich with the phenomenal experience of the appearing world, it's in another form of noetic imagery that Barfieldian sense of the necessity to rediscover meaning in poetic form can be found, and in which Coleridgean themes of that polarity of the imagination and its relation to the divine can be considered. In this reconciliation of a seeing with the imagination, a noetic vision, there is an approach to a changed relation to nature, a means of seeing and experiencing the world anew through the creative logos, that counters the disenchanted, the disenchantment conveyed in Emerson's words, that the axis of vision is not coincident with the axis of things, and so they appear not transparent but opaque. Barfield's thought can be framed within Neoplatonic themes of the imagination, particularly as this suffuses experience with that felt relation between an archetypal original unity, in which creativity and incarnation are directed towards the spiritual wonder of the imagination, and in which the animating force of inspired thought is Coleridge's repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. Barfield, for whom the nature of inspiration, archetypal images, and poetic meaning are closely interconnected, compels the idea of a vision of the sacred made present in the creative participation of imagination in consciousness. For great poetry, he writes, is the progressive incarnation of life and consciousness. The detachment felt in the shift to irreligious consciousness, the perspectival view of the camera sequence, and the archetypal images of the common origin, as Barfield terms it, are closely interwoven. These ideas, alongside Barfield's writings on poetic experience and meaning, convey a deep sense of how the imagination might once more reach the heights of self-awareness and participation centrally connected to Coleridge's thought, and of a poetic and imaginative philosophy. The criticism of what Barfield terms logomorphism, the projection of contemporary thought onto the historical consciousness of the past, remains a powerful sense in which the historical soul was part of a world in which it participated, and which has become, in the manner of detachment or dualism, experienced in poetic diction and the nature of inspiration. What Barfield calls the previously unapprehended relationships of soul and world were experienced but not seen as such, are a kind of metaphor, and imagination can see them again, as he describes it, following Shelley. This finds a deep understanding in the Gospels and the Logos, a polarity of the Trinity, a meaning in which parts and whole form a complex interrelation of the one and the many, or as Coleridge puts it, as cited by Barfield, the power which discloses itself from within as a principle of unity in the many. This is the Logos as utterance and image, realized as the creative act of lived experience in the realization of the inner origin of outward forms. This fundamental relation of inner and outer worlds, of the archetypal forms that are created in the active imagination, suggests an important legacy to Barfield's thought in relation to Coleridge. Barfield writes of Neoplatonism as a stream of thought, where there is verse in which one feels moving the breath of the creative word, the breath of the logos, and of a deep human response to the logos, the breath that is alone the true breath of poetry. And he alludes there to the poetry of Kathleen Raine, whose verse speaks frequently of that nature of the infinite image appearing from out of time, and of the sense of its appearance as connecting that relation of the invisible and the visible, of that being, as she says, which is the breath of life. The very essence of the romantic inspiration, Barfield writes, is that it imports a reciprocal relation between the spirit of man and the spirit of nature. It is, he continues, rather as if a musical instrument, which was being played on, an Aeolian harp perhaps, played on by nature herself, fell silent for a while. And then, after an interval, when it began to sound again, it was no longer merely an instrument, but had become aware of itself as such, and could itself take part in the playing of itself. Now, for the first time, we have a relation between man and nature in which the two-ness is as important as the oneness. The harp then indicates an image of reciprocity, of participation, of a unity that symbolizes the nature of polarity and points itself to an original image. The image is thus the imaginative source of an essential unity of spirit and reason. The poetic relation to the image is a participation in the likeness of that image. This is a sense of the meaning of the harp, of the nature of inspiration that must be rediscovered through the lenses of the contemporary dispositions to projective distance. But the camera is also key, for in having arrived to a point of historical consciousness, a form of projection emerges through which a choice has to be made, a seeing of nothingness or a seeing of light. And Barfield has pointed out that a seeing of nothing without leads to a kind of seeing of nothing within. Barfield points to the connection of the word window to wind-eye, and his reconciliation of the duality of modern consciousness in its inspired relation to the harp and its projective relation to the camera indicate a means by which the evolution of consciousness can be understood. The archetypal image is a source of likeness without sameness, a window in the frame of the finite in which an infinite image is seen. Plotinus writes that if then one sees oneself having become this, then one has himself as a likeness of that, and one moves from oneself as from the image to the archetype. The reconciliatory image, the participatory image of the harp and the eye, as balancing the competing tensions of inspiration and projection in the evolution of consciousness, is figured into the promissory note of Barfield's conclusions. Is it fanciful, I wonder, writes Barfield, to think of a sort of mini-harp stretched across the window of the eye, an Apollo's harp, if you will, as perhaps not a bad image for the joy of looking with imagination. This sense of the relation of joy and imagination to reciprocation of the soul and the transcendent is a point so profoundly expressed throughout Barfield's work. If then in one sense the camera is projective, suggesting a power of understanding which at the same time alienates, then to begin once more to experience nature as image, as he says, and to see that this is the faculty of imagination apprehending the outward form as the image or symbol of an inner meaning, is to again see the image in reciprocity to its archetype. In new modes of self-understanding, the change felt in the creative word can find a way out of the apparent meaninglessness towards which the conclusions of a projective detachment often lead. In seeing a new form of participatory consciousness, there is a new relation to the breath of inspiration, a breath at once seen and spoken as the appearance of the word and the special significance of poetic meaning. It is in this way that Barfield's Coleridgean imagination points towards a renewed philosophy imagination, based in that animated breeze of the inspired image, of the harp and the transformed image of participatory vision. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi, that was great.
So, questions for Gareth?
Hi, thanks, Gareth. It was really good.
Sorry,
I think I got that.
Sorry about that.
Can I just wanted to pick up on, you brought us beautifully to those final words, and just your quoting them again made me think about how significant Barfield's use of the word joy is towards the end of that essay when he speaks of the joy of seeing with the imagination. Now, in the essay, Barfield goes on to link that interestingly with C.S. Lewis.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly has Lewis and surprised by joy and the whole thing. But actually, and Lewis, of course, gets the phrase surprised by joy from Wordsworth. But I think when Barfield speaks of the joy of seeing with the imagination in the context, as you've brought it there, of music as well and breath, I think he probably is thinking, Graham would probably come in on this, but he's probably thinking of that moment in Dejection, an Ode, when Coleridge says, "Thou needst not ask of me what this strong music in the soul may be, what and wherein it doth exist, this light, this glory, this fair luminous mist, this beautiful and beauty-making power." And then Coleridge answers it with the very word that Barfield wants to use at that point, which is joy. This is from the Dejection and Ode. Joy, a virtuous lady, joy. Joy is the spirit and the power which wedding nature to us gives in dower, a new earth and a new heaven. Coleridge, of course, then goes on to lament that that joy has vanished. But I was very struck by it when Barfield, because in some ways it's quite a demanding intellectual essay. It takes you into the history of philosophy and it uses the camera sequence. But I'm really struck, and I think this is almost completely missing from contemporary philosophical discourse, that unashamedly Barfield invokes and expects and asks us to experience with him not simply the intellectual satisfaction of considering a conundrum or solving a puzzle, but actually joy of imagination, joy of seeing. And I wonder if that isn't something really distinctive. It's there in Platonism, but that Barfield's reintroducing to us.
Yes, if I'm not mistaken, he the first introduction to poetic diction, he says that he's going to sort of speak in images rather than a set of formal arguments about the nature of the felt change of consciousness. So I think there's this sense that embodied in the writing itself is this felt change of consciousness, that he practices it as much as he...
Yeah, that's really what I was saying. There's something about the nature of the writing itself.
Yeah.
If there's not some joy or lift, that sense of the joy of the visual imagination, then you're not getting what he's saying.
Yeah. Yeah, and I suppose you talked about Lewis, and I was reminded of the Weight of Glory, where Lewis talks about the indescribable something of which objects become for a moment the messengers, and this idea of the door on which you've been knocking being opened and so on.
Yeah, in fact, that essay, Weight of Glory, somebody should write somewhere, sometime, an account of Lewis's Barfieldian moments. Because I think when Lewis is in his, what he called his bow wow dogmatism, and is really laying down the line about exact Christian orthodoxy, for him at that point, Barfield is a guilty pleasure. But when Lewis really rises to it, and in that same essay, the sermon, The Weight of Glory, there's a bit where he says, we don't just want to contemplate, as it were, in a distant and detached way, the beauties of nature. We want to pass into them. We want to be clothed in them. We want to put them on. We want to put on the morning star. And that seems to me to be like a totally Barfieldian moment in Lewis.
Yeah, yeah.
Am I still visible?
Yes.
Okay. I've slightly lost you all because I was fiddling around and now seem to, I can only see you one at a time. But Gareth, this is why I was looking around in files. Do you think that Barfield actually solved what you might call the subject-object problem? It seemed to me that Coleridge got, in one way, very little further than Kant, in that Kant really said, well, we can know things, but we can't know things in themselves. We can have ideas that are constitutive, but really we can't arrive at genuine noumenal and generative ideas. Therefore, the hope of creating a knowledge through the union of subject and object was kind of impossible because you had an unknowable nature with no real power to know nature. And it seemed to me that in some ways, this was an argument I was having with a friend, that in some ways, life has got stuck at that point, and things like phenomenology have come along and said, right, we can solve this problem in a slightly different way. We'll sort of hide the real problem and we'll deal with it in another way. And I was wondering whether you thought Barfield had come up with a different solution.
Well, I wouldn't want to misrepresent some of his more complex philosophical points, but I think in Poetic Diction in particular, in the appendixes, one of the main appendices to that, he extends quite a lengthy critique of Kant and sees him as representative of this idea of logomorphism that I mentioned in the paper. And I suppose he sees it that there's I hesitate to use the word dialectical, I suppose, which is maybe more in the Hegelian sense, but he seems to see it, as far as I understand, that Kant sort of hypothesizes, if you like, that relation between subject and object, between the transcendental unity of apperception and phenomenal appearance. Whereas Barfield, I suppose, if you think about his writings on the rainbow in Saving the Appearances, or how he elucidates different understandings of that sort of idea of the evolution of consciousness, wants to sort of take that argument around the nature of appearances into more of a, I suppose, historically evolving one. He doesn't see it as being static. And I suppose he wants to place an emphasis on an idea that there's a sort of inner world of being, or rather that really philosophy is the thinking of being, if you will, rather than the thinking of the relation of how a subject stands in judgment to an object. And in that, actually, it's funnily enough, because how I came to reading Barfield was through Hegel, funnily enough, and through a lot of my interests, but also dissatisfactions with Hegel, and through a sort of Platonic reading of Hegel, really, for the very reason that Hegel seems to try to dispense with any account of intellectual intuition into a sort of totally discursive speech. And so, I mean, in a long-winded way, I don't think I could necessarily answer that with any finality, but I don't think that I think he would and has tried to show where he takes Kant to be wrong.
Yeah, basically, he's posing Kant in a different way to the one I've posed.
Yeah.
But if I could interject there, I think Gareth's point is about the historical dimension is very significant. Obviously, there's a sense in which Kant is a thinker for whom the historical does not play a very big role. So the transcendental conditions of experience are, in a sense, timeless, right? And so obviously it was in a sense, the post-Kantians picked up Herder's critique of Kant, that the concepts are not themselves timeless, that concepts are actually linked to time. But there is a sense in which Kant also gave a hint to the post-Kantians, and one that I think Hegel takes up, and perhaps, well, I think certainly Coleridge and Barfield, and that is because of the structure of the three critiques. So if you've got the first critique with its theory of the construction of the phenomenal world, and then you've got your second critique, the critique of practical reason, in which freedom is preserved, but preserved in the noumenal realm, and is the arena of the primacy of pure practical reason. It is the third critique that offers a mediation between this otherwise irresolvable duality. And of course, part of that is the notion of the genius, and part of that is the artist as genius. And then, of course, you know, Kant is drawing on this tradition, going back to Shaftesbury and a whole a strand of 18th century aesthetics, culminating in Schelling's notion that the the genius is the one who is able to reconcile the unconscious with the conscious, with nature and subjectivity. So I think this, obviously, in the third critique, Kant is much coyer about the power of the aesthetic to do this reconciling work. But there are suggestions of it. The suggestions of it in his doctrine that beauty symbolizes morality. I think also in his idea of genius, also his idea of aesthetic ideas. So I think there's a sense in which Kant is, for these post-Kantians, in a sense, I'm thinking here of Barfield in the broader sense as a kind of post-Kantian, is both a target, right? It's the kind of dualism that you want to overcome, and yet Kant at the same time is offering certain suggestions that are sort of deeply productive for this tradition. It's just that you have to bear in mind that unlike sort of contemporary, predominantly analytic Kant interpreters, it's the first critique that is the main interest of Kant. And then you've got this weird ethical theory with this rather peculiar doctrine of the relationship between the ethical and the noumenal. And then, of course, you've got the very odd third critique that only the aestheticians look at. I mean, for this post-Kantian tradition, it's the third critique that's offering the key, in a way, to resolve the whole system.
Thanks, that's incredibly helpful. It nuances. I wanted to come back to Graham, if I could, but maybe this relates to it. I wanted to push back a little about your saying that Coleridge was in some sense still stuck with Kant, or not taking it further, I'm not so sure about that. If you're thinking the Kant of the first critique and you're thinking of this absolute divide between the nominal and the phenomenal, and you're saying that Kant, obviously we're in some sense the very shape of our minds and our own categories construct what we see as the phenomena and the reality. I don't think Coleridge is. I think Coleridge totally understands that and concedes most of that and gets that in Kant, but I don't think he's stuck there. Precisely.
Well, Malcolm, I agree. He kind of says, right, Kant is stuck, but I'm not going to.
Exactly. In fact, the way he becomes unstuck is by a theological move in that 13th chapter. It strikes me that when he says imagination is the living power and prime agent of all perception, then all the Kantians of that earlier Kantian will applaud and say, yeah, didn't I always tell you, you're not seeing what's there. But when Coleridge then says, and is a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am, that's how he gets out of it. He actually says, look, of course we're constructing this, but the very mind and category and energy and idea with which we construct it, so I've got a dog in the background, the thing we're doing that with is itself directly connected to the one who breathes the noumena into being. So if, as it were, the logos, to make an analogy, the logos is the poet, and the noumena is the poem, and the phenomena are what we, the readers, make of it, Coleridge is actually saying, yeah, but the poet is inside us or right alongside us, speaking into us the meaning of the poem. So I think that's how he gets it. I think he thinks the mind and imagination that make something out of what's there into the phenomena is working in the same way as an echo or repetition of the maker of what's there. And so that can give you a certain amount of confidence in perception that if you were purely the first critique, you wouldn't have. Is that fair?
Well, Malcolm, shall we wait and see what you make of my paper? Because I think it's all in there in one way or another. So I think it's fair, but I'm not sure we're going to agree finally in the end. We'll see, I think. Or you'll have to tell me whether I've made sense.
Yeah, thanks. I may have to watch it on the recording because of other exigencies, but I will engage with it.
Okay, so I'm very conscious of the time. We have gone a bit over. So I hope that's given us a bit of space to discuss Gareth's wonderful paper. Shall we then move over now to Jake Grefenstette and his discussion of Owen Barfield's novels, I believe.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you, all of you, for being here. This has been tremendous. My name is Jake Grefenstette. I'm originally from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I'm a PhD student in theology, studying with Professor Hedley as a member of King's College here in Cambridge. I'll give a brief introduction to the context of my work on Barfield before getting into my essay. Barfield observes that there's a pendulum of academic anxiety that swings between apologetic emphases on Coleridge the philosopher and Coleridge the critic poet. Barfield also observes, rightly I think, that up to his time, hardly anyone was interested in considering how these two Coleridges overlap. Since many of what he calls biographical comparative accounts read into Coleridge a natural and repressed aversion to Christianity, religious musings and imaginative works are often damned as toadying to orthodoxy, thus disqualifying serious theological readings of Coleridge's poetry and criticism. For my PhD thesis, my argument is that Barfield and other 20th century figures, now fundamental to the interdisciplinary field of theology and literature, Eliot, Lewis, Sugermo, both acknowledge this intersection in Coleridge's thought and see it as archetypal and their own elaboration of theology and literature. I was most recently a student at the U Chicago Divinity School, where the academic discipline of religion and literature was first formalized in the US. But even there, I had friends and classmates scoff at the thesis that Coleridge played a role, certainly not a central role, in the field of religion and literature. I faced similar resistance in my undergraduate. Really, the only place outside of England I found the most support for this thesis was during my master's in Beijing, where there happens to be a contingent of 1980s poets interested in a sort of Coleridgean theopoetics. But after all that opposition, I'm delighted to finally arrive in Cambridge, where there is this whole world of theological study with Coleridge as gravitational center, and this much with thanks to Professor Hedley, Dr. Guite, and others here. So to get into it, in my studies to date, I have observed, like many of the company present, a burgeoning sense of Owen Barfield's undervaluation. This sense is primarily evidenced in anxieties reiterated in prefaces and introductions to justify the philosopher on the basis of his inheritors. Works and talks on Barfield almost universally begin with a reminder that there are more than two Inklings. We're reminded of his influence on poet laureates, correspondence with Eliot, Bloom's appropriation of his criterion of strangeness, and above all, his status as philological fundament for Lewis and Tolkien. While popularity justice projects are on track to give Barfield's philosophical canon the monographic treatments they deserve, there is in this new world of Barfieldians relatively marginal attention paid to his imaginative works. Today, I'm going to speak to a cornerstone of this category, Barfield's Burgeon trilogy, comprised of this ever-diverse pair, Worlds Apart, and Unancestral Voice, written between 1950 and 1965. I'll be focusing on the first volume and its Coleridgean metaphysics of imagination, participation, and the Trinity. Now, a straightforward hypothesis for the marginalization of Barfield's fictions might reasonably point to criticisms of redundancy. If the Burgeon trilogy is paraphrased only in terms of its conceit, it doesn't appear to be doing anything not already done in saving the appearances or the rediscovery of meaning. The structure of the trilogy, for those who have not read the novels, follows Burden/Burgeon, Barfield's alter ego or egos, an imaginatively schizophrenic solicitor whose interior monologue is split between his creative capacity, Burgeon, and Burden, his exterior self, who deals in fact collection, legal drudgery, administration, association, in other words, secondary imagination, fancy. It raises the question of whether these persons are distinguished or, as with Shaftesbury, as Professor Hedley mentioned, possibly divided, or else some third thing. And as Professor Hedley observes in Living Forms of the Imagination, this is a distinctly Coleridgean move. Framed thusly, even someone who has not read the novel might guess at its central allegory. It simultaneously stages Coleridge's biography of 13 distinction and parodies Lewis's early distinctions of mind and body. Frederick Dennehy, taking this view, introduces the first book in the trilogy as a playful attack on Lewis and his visceral aversion to anything that appears to blur distinctions. Indeed, when C.S. Lewis's Avatar encounters Burden in chapter 6 of Ever-Diverse Pair, He proves, like the Catholic priest in Fleabag, the only character who sees behind burden to the imaginative Burgeon. But, I want to argue, such reductions to parity or relegations to redundancy miss the principal point of Barfield's decisions in form. As we see from examples in the text, Barfield takes from Coleridge the conviction that imaginative literature proper is not reducible, and is indeed necessary in our participatorily lapsed condition to do a kind of talking about God and the self that philosophy finds difficult. Through narrative self-reflections on consciousness and literary form in the trilogy, Barfield, like Brooks, comes to insist on the heresy of paraphrase. But Barfield's heterodoxy is not merely literary critical, it is also theological. Formally, imaginative literature offers a theology of its own, where phone, mere sound, is either exposed as vacuous, or else inspired with logos, meaning, to create true speech, rima. This idea is developed in particular over the course of Diverse Pair, with the teleology of Burden and Burgeon's binitarian collapse and final participation becomes a masterful symbol of the Trinity. After we are introduced to the Burden-Burgeon dynamic in the first chapters of Diverse Pair, we immediately encounter a series of metaphysical theses on the imagination. And straight away, we understand why Barfield says Burgeon didn't sell as well as Aslan. There's some great lawyer humor on the playful side of Kafkaesque absurdity, but the majority of the book is technical, devoted to Burden and Burgeon reflecting upon the metaphysical anatomy of the person they comprise. These musings are interspersed with Burden's client negotiations that jump erratically between realism, surrealism, stream of consciousness, poetry, stage play dialogue, and a passage Barfield identifies in a note as autobiographical, thereby reproducing Burgeon's schizophrenic creative frustrations in the very form of the book. Coleridge arrives early on the scene in Burgeon's first effort to define himself, where he claims the vocation of the shaping spirit of imagination, lifting the phrase of dejection. Burgeon, the shaping spirit, is explicit about the meta-narrative goal of the novel, to write about nature, capital N, and other people by, quote, using my own feelings solely as instruments of perception and fountains of diction, sacrificing them like glass in the window to let the light in and the warmth of the outside world. Here's a clear endorsement of the wind harp and the romantics' war between the harp and camera. But this is where the novel begins to complicate readings as mere Lewis parody or biography of paraphrase. From the earliest of Burden's legal client episodes, it is obvious that the imaginative Burgeon colossally fails to deliver on his promise of this interpersonal reflection. Although Burgeon blames Burden, we detect in the imaginative Burgeon some faulty views on the imagination. For example, he says, and again, this is a supposedly imaginative half speaking, a painter can only paint what he can see, and if there is something which girdles and confines his entire horizon, must paint that or nothing. Now, this image can sustain multiple interpretations. On the one hand, it could be read as positively illuminative of Coleridge's picture of energy and thinking about thinking, but at its core, this is a straw thesis set up for the payoff of its future subversion. As Barfield insists in what Coleridge thought, imagination that rearranges what's in view is not imagination proper. The story builds on this conviction to demonstrate that imagination, which participates in the act of the I am, cannot be cleanly vivisected from Burden's half of the person. Indeed, as we get to the heart of Diverse Pair, we find the Burden-Burgeon relationship does less to parody either the complete conflation or complete distinction of imagination and fancy than to affirm their polar interdependence. The book lives in this tension of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. The most illuminative consequence of this tension, and the point of departure from Coleridge's model, is a robust picture of Burden's role, the unimaginative one, in the creative process. Late in the book, Burgeon decides that if it is the burdens of the world who keep the traditions alive, it is the Burgeons who create them. The burdens cannot make anything, they can only collect and preserve. But the book does not settle at this point of synthesis. A startling disruption comes when we learn that, contrary to initial implications, Burden, the exterior, does in fact create. He doesn't create particularly well, but he is, importantly for Barfield, capable of metaphor and constructive dialogue with the imaginative Burgeon. Barfield's objective and complicating the schizophrenic dynamic in this way makes sense when we consider his views on the history of human consciousness. Burgeon laments modern society, a time when the soul dies very comfortably, but still does not like hearing the death sentence formally pronounced. The easiest solution, one Burgeon considers, would be to kill Burden off. Burden entertains the reciprocal. But humanity has passed the point of no return. Burden cannot fold back into Burgeon. He cannot return to his state of original participation. He must be elevated to something else entirely. After constructing this philosophical synthesis and the resulting picture of imaginative polarity, the text proceeds with meta-narrative experiments about the role of language and literature in the cultivation of participation. The end of chapter 3, for example, finds Burden/Burgeon on recess from court, reconsidering their relationship on a riverside bench. After Burden mocks Burgeon for a characteristically digressive ekphrasis on sunlight caught in peaks of waves, the poet dares his vocational partner to co-compose a pair of quatrains. As a disinclined Burden realizes he can outrun himself, the mundane half acquiesces, and the following poem results. Temple, parentheses, solicitor song. Burgeon says, "The little waves on London River are bombed with light. They flash and quiver and laugh and toss back to the giver his shattered shards. They dance their dance." The poem is then completed by Burden, the unimaginative half. Burden, "I dance my dance too in that station, to which he called me litigation, to gallop the tide of fornication, leases and lusts and loan finance." Before we address the issue of Burden-Burgeon dual creation raised here, let's examine in isolation the elements of Burgeon's half of the poem. First, we have the image of the wave, which is at once sonorous and visual, producing laughter and momentarily capturing fiery lights. There's possibly an imagistic predecessor in the Mariner's Western Wave Olive Flame, and more obviously a metaphysical precedent in traditions of cosmic dance and the by then banalized "more than the light of outward day shines there" from Coleridge's Monody on the Death of Chatterton. There's a lot to work with here, and the broader linguistic legacy of Barfield on light is explored in Verlyn Flagger's book, Splintered Light. But most important here is the influence of the wind eye and harp dualities developed in Coleridge's poetry. Barfield was adamant about the importance of Coleridge's notebooks and marginalia, and given his interest in the wind harp, he certainly would have read this notebook poem fragment from 1796 from Coleridge. "Light cargoes waft of modulated sound from viewless Hybla brought." Here, similar to the unseen giver in Burgeon's poem, an unseen Hybla suggests a location divine. Coleridge's verse enacts both a sound-light duality as well as a grammatical duality, and that light cargoes waft can be read as either noun-verb-noun or noun-noun-verb. Coleridge's notebook fragment, of course, finds full expression in his Aeolian harp, which seems to be a reworking of this line or vice versa. "A light and sound, a sound like power and light, rhythm in all thought and joyance everywhere." Burden's response to Burgeon's poem, on the other hand, at first seems constructed with an intentionally blatant disregard for Coleridge's images and Barfield's own poetic criteria of the strange and the archaic. He ends his quatrain square on the unanticipated final line, loan finance. This is distasteful to Burgeon. If anything, Burden's pseudo-poetry stands at the trough between Barfield's historical bookends of participations, original and final. Taken in the context of the story, the quatrain's hypocrisy is an indictment of society as Barfield saw it. The Burden points to a God-given vocation in gliding the tide of fornication. The very chapter heading is divorce, parentheses, undefended, referring to a legal phenomenon he elsewhere designates as immoral. He has in fact just come from a court settling where he facilitated a separation despite his ethical objections to the particular case. This all plays in, of course, to the further hypocrisy of Burden and Burgeon's futile efforts towards their own divorce. To the credit of the unimaginative Burden, however, he is able to sustain the metaphor of the dance and tide, and after being awakened by this unfamiliar process of attempting verse, he musters the courage in the next chapter to criticize Burgeon's shortcomings. The principal charge against the imagination is rhematophobia, which Walter de la Mare footnotes as Barfield's denomination. sphere of the spoken word. Three important terms orbit this coinage: phone, mere sound; logos, meaning; rima, true speech, sound with meaning. These are all defined by the narrator in the text. As Burgeon formulates the triad in a series of internal asides, we see the concept reified in a series of failed communications with its external interlocutors. Burgeon relates, quote, "We kept letting the client's lips move without understanding what she was saying. Logos slipped away, and rima reverted to bare phone." This vacation of logos, which becomes explicitly theological in the final dream judgment that ends the book, is foregrounded as Burgeon's greatest deficiency. It is on the grounds of this interpersonal defect that the dream judge ultimately sentenced Burgeon to continue practicing as a solicitor. Thus, meaningful dialogue, like meaningful monologue, is identified as essential to the telos of human consciousness. As Burgeon comes to an awareness of a new and loftier plane in which he is somehow contriving to live, he acknowledges the centrality of poetry in the following epiphanic moment. He says, while talking to a client, "All personal animosity or even irritation was transcended into that larger communion of patient endurance into which the client, too, without she knowing it, seemed to be mysteriously and charitably drawn. At length, the silent commerce of our soul clothed itself in a kind of rhythmic, liturgical splendor which, if it could be expressed at all, could only be expressed in verse." Burgeon at this point composes another poem, and we are surprised to find Burgeon again contributing, this time unsolicited. But the epiphanic moment does not last long. Burgeon still relish in their distance. Their poem acknowledges a deep and hidden love for the client, but their spite for each other overcomes them, and the poem ends with the two protagonists in a feud expelling the woman from their office. The homiletic bent of the episode is that although Burgeon successfully conceptualizes imaginative polarity and final participation, he is guilty of doing nothing to hasten the advent of the latter. It is the Augustinian position of knowing the truth without wanting it yet. "O Lord, let me participate, but not yet." Even the chastising command Burden and Burgeon throw at each other, which is, "Attention, are you attending?" is purposely hollow. Neither attends to the outside world, but even if they did, this alone would be insufficient. Attention has a unique meaning for Barfield, one subordinate to thought. Attention and thought require effort and the more animate energy, respectively. This formulation, drawn up in What Coleridge Thought, is Barfield's synthesis of ideas from the friend and aids to reflection. When language of energy and will finally surface at the end of the book, Burgeon and Burden decide against killing each other in favor of a joint quest to participate. Burden is sentenced to reading William Blake, and Burgeon appreciates himself as a mind which is capable of soaring, but soars rather too easily, like a balloon. Similar to what Dr. Guite has written on Barfield's use of the Trinity to explain the ontology of participation, Barfield here invokes a Trinitarian, or in the case of Burden and Burgeon, Binitarian ontology. The promised unity plus distinction of Burden/Burgeon takes as implicit model the unity and distinction of the Trinity and the God-human relationship in paradise. And indeed, outside of the critical episodes, pictures of homoousian unity pepper the book. Some of it is comedic, as the unholy trinity of the three solicitor archetypes and their formal unification in Burgeon's vision of the absolute solicitor. Others are serious, as Burgeon's citation to Burden of the Bhagavad Gita, "Surrendering all actions to me, with thy thoughts and the supreme self, from hope and egoism freed, and of mental fever cured." As we reflect back on a work first dismissed as parodic, we see in retrospect 5 layers to the narrative. First, the novel is superficially satirical, attacking Lewis's hard lines between body and mind. At the second layer, as the text jumps between a half dozen narrative forms, including aporia, which Dr. Vernon identified as key, Barfield subverts his satirical facade, narrativizing the ways in which the imaginative faculties of human consciousness have indeed developed in the direction of imaginative vocational schizophrenia, and this as a result of lapsed participation. The third layer, inaugurated with the collaborative temple poem, complicates the architecture of the schizophrenia. Cashing in on his initial ironizing, Barfield synthesizes the first 2 layers with a history of interdependence and interrelation of burden and Burgeon. In the midst of ruminations on waves, light, water, and sound, common patristic metaphors of Trinitarian ontology, Barfield plants the seeds of a hopeful teleology of a final participation. On the ontological model of the brief binitarian unity experienced by Barfield and Burgeon in their poetic compositions, the text points towards a Trinitarian theology that Barfield considers ultimately necessary to understanding humanity's relationship to God. Now, the novel may well have ended at this point, but coming to the fourth point of his argument, Barfield uses this moment of epiphany to argue for imaginative literature's theological function. The conclusion, of course, is that poetry is the best means of breathing rima, of expressing joy. But Barfield's claim more broadly redeems the diversity of literary forms employed to this point, a facet the novel originally and ostensibly framed as symptomatic of its schizophrenic character. What's really remarkable about the novel is this is a second point in which the narrative argument of diverse pair could conceivably conclude. But instead, Barfield spends the remainder of the novel playing out Burden and Burgeon's hypocrisy. In the quest for intrapersonal coherence, Burgeon neglects his ethical interpersonal duties staged in meetings with his clients. Although the Rima Logos Phone model is intellectually epiphanic for Burgeon, Barfield subverts any illusion of spiritual security and dwelling in one's own passio and comprehension without compassion. To sum up, Burgeon and Burden, imagination and the mundane, are first parodically divided, then genuinely distinct, then necessarily interdependent, polar, then with a hope of final participation, and on the model of the Trinity, capable of unification. Original participation is preserved for Barfield in the Passion of Poetry, but he insists poetry and imaginative literature must also predict the Trinitarian compassion of final participation. If the Burgeon trilogy's peripheral status is due to its ostensible vulnerability to reduction to a product conceit, we must insist to readers that this vulnerability is merely ostensible. This is a formally self-conscious novel, which masterfully narrowizes Coleridge's definition of metaphysics offered in The Friend, the referring of the mind to its own consciousness for truths indispensable to its own happiness. Taking Coleridge as a point of departure, Barfield imagines a participatory world that the imagination, along with Burden, that strange growth in the modern human consciousness, together ordain. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that, that very rich and helpful account of the prose work of Owen Barfield. Questions?
I've got a slightly pedestrian question, or mundane, perhaps I should say. I've just been struck today by the sort of allusions to William Blake, and you mentioned there, you know, Burden's punishment. Does Barfield treat William Blake sort of in a sustained way anywhere? I've been trying to think of that. I can't think of anything, but someone might be able to help me on that. And then even more, perhaps again, the third Earl keeps coming up today. And I just wondered whether Barfield ever refers to Shaftesbury directly as well, if anyone knows that, just for me to follow those threads.
I have not countered Shaftesbury reference. Blake is a frequent participant in the novels, at least, and there's a bit of a introduction to Blake in the final chapters of Ever Diverse Pair. I know he speaks about him at length elsewhere, but I can't remember where. Is there anyone who's able to lend a hand?
Well, I know that grandfather had sort of Shaftesbury's original set of works from about the, I think the 18th century, aren't they? And yep. I've got them now, so I can just look them up if you want, and I can tell you what he's got.
Oh, that's splendid. If I may say, Shaftesbury, it's easy for us to forget, but Shaftesbury was perhaps the most influential British philosopher in the 18th century. He was immensely influential, partly because of his style. He was the sort of Lord Byron of philosophy. I mean, he was, you know, to the 18th century what Byron was to the 19th century. I think many writers saw in Shaftesbury what they wanted to see. And he was the embodiment of the, the sort of noble philosopher figure. So this is sometimes a bit puzzling for, contemporary historians of philosophy, because they'd say, well, why was Shaftesbury so important? But he was immensely significant. And in a way, 18th century aesthetics on the continent was grounded in Shaftesbury. There's another point that I'd also want to mention, and that is that Shaftesbury, although we think of him, we associate him with the deists. And Coleridge, for example, is often quite rude about Shaftesbury. But Shaftesbury was his first work was an edition of Whichcote, the figure often thought to be the father of the Cambridge Platonists. So there is, I think, here a kind of interesting link between the great romantics like Coleridge, Shaftesbury, and the Cambridge Platonists. I mean, back into the Italian Renaissance and then through into late antiquity. So I think Shaftesbury is often a mediating figure here.
That's really interesting.
I had a quick question, which is, your talk titled the Burgeon Trilogy, and you often refer to the trilogy, but you were talking about one book, the first book in the trilogy. I was wondering which of the 3 books in the trilogy you most enjoyed, Jake?
Oh man, it's so again for context, the other 2 books, one involves a sort of a dialogue with Burgeon and the sort of mentor figure, and then the other is this kind of symposium. The first book, I really just spoke to that today for purposes of time, and because that's the one that focuses on the relationship. But I loved On Ancestral Voice. It's difficult, and you think sort of everything is laid out and every diverse pair, but he in the 60s, Barfield just keeps developing. There definitely is the sense that he that what was cited earlier, that he has one thought that he develops. That's in no way to diminish the complexity of him as a thinker. And you just read On Ancestral Voice, and that's obvious immediately. But do you have a personal favorite?
On Ancestral Voice as well is my favorite. But right now I'm reading Worlds Apart as well, and I'm getting a lot out of that as well.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Yeah, I have just a quick question. That is about the novel writing. I mean, among the Inklings, I mean they all write novels. I think rather as the Romantics tried to write plays. This is, I say, a very crude and ignorant question, but is there a particular reason why Lewis, Tolkien, Barfield, Williams were writing novels as well as poetry and criticism and philosophy? And
I think there might be a double answer to that. One is to do with the agenda that they have, all of them, which in Oxford of their day was really quite a subversive agenda, which was to get this stuff out there in the popular mind, that the novel was in their day, and perhaps still is in ours, the prime popular form. And, Williams was accused of writing, as it were, theological potboilers. But, Eliot said of Williams, well, he may be writing potboilers, but he boils a good pot. And, so I think there's partly an agenda which is to do with kind of busting these things out of the small circle of academia and letting them live as living ideas in a wider thing. So I think there's that. But the other reason, I think, is actually hinted at directly by Barfield in the end of the Harp and the Camera essay, when he talks about Märchen. He talked about Märchen, I don't know how it's pronounced, but about these tales, the notion.
The Märchen, yep.
So what you get, when Barfield is developing this idea that out of the emerging individual consciousness comes the as it were, ascribing onto myth of signature.
Yeah.
Poetry is precisely myth with signature. So what Barfield is saying is, if we are to return out of a world which is now mere script and signature and out of which myth has faded away, to back to a re-enchantment, we mustn't lose signature. And the distinctive moment of signature, says Barfield at the end of that thing, will be the tale or the story that's been written by a conscious individual, but an individual who is willing to have their consciousness formed and shaped by the great myths. And he lays that out. It's a very interesting thing in that essay. It doesn't, unfortunately, because it's quite a late essay, it's one of the big controversies in Inkling's studies, which is now a thing, you know, is whether or not the Inklings were a writers group with a real agenda and a purpose, or whether they were just, as Humphrey Carpenter said, a bunch of people who just happened to know Lewis. So the tide in Inkling's studies is very much flowing in the favor of saying that they've got a program and they know what they're doing.
Yes.
And there's a real sense, actually, in which I think Barfield puts his finger on what it is. He's actually saying, of course, poetry is a prime thing, but nobody's reading long narrative poems anymore, as Lewis found out to his cost when he wrote Dimer. And the personal, therefore, signature story, which takes up and restates in our age the great mythological themes, is to be the form in which this new integrated consciousness might be expressed. And basically they all have a go. And it has to be said, you know, Tolkien is the one who does it with huge success. And, you know, I mean, to be fair, great as they are, certainly there are Williams and in both Williams and Barfield's novels, and to some degree in some of the Lewis things, the as it were, the theological or ideological agenda is not sufficiently integrated into the narrative, whereas of course in Tolkien they're seamless. But I think that's why they do it. And I certainly think, by the way, I love that talk. You know, I hadn't taken the burden. I really love on ancestral voices, you know, but that's more because of the part in me that loves Platonic dialogue. But I think the fictional works of both Barfield and Williams need some reassessment and bringing back to the fore, even though there are various ways in which they're technically flawed in comparison with Tolkien. I mean, I do think that they merit serious attention. And, you know, it was great to have that last talk. I thought that was really superb in terms of particularly your 5 layers there at the end. I thought that was very good.
Mm. No, thank you. I was also, my question really about the novel, I think you've answered beautifully, Malcolm, because I mean, it seems to me that the very form of the novel is sort of deeply Barfieldian in the sense that it's the combination of the very modern and the mythic. Mm. Because obviously the novel as a form is so modern that, I mean, Coleridge will speak very dismissively of novels. I mean, that's the most vulgar and superficial form of entertainment.
Well, the very name tells you that.
Exactly. That's right. And yet, of course,
Douglas, be careful. He was at one stage thinking of writing a novel to portray all his philosophical ideas. Of course, it came to nothing. Being
yes, but
he didn't think nothing of the novel.
Well, yes, but you're familiar with those passages in which he speaks very dismissively of the novel.
And, he liked Fielding.
Yeah. Mm.
And he said of Scott, "I've read far too much for my own good."
Ah, right. Oh, yes. Well, thank you. Yes, well, I must correct my own
poetry as well, though. Yeah.
But I mean, of course, my point is just that, I mean, the really great novels are those that are mythic. And if you think even the 20th century, where you, in a sense, wouldn't expect it. I mean, think of Thomas Mann, Joseph and His Brothers, is a thoroughly mythic novel and one of the greatest novels of the of the 20th century. So I think that it's interesting that the novel should assume this role, as it were, the polarity of the very modern, the deeply subjective, and yet riding on these mythic roots. Anyway, that was just my point.
May I ask a question? Which of Barfield's books can be called a novel? As far as I understand, none of them is a novel. Only if we mean something very new, as you have said that. But what is your opinion? In my opinion, none of his books can be called a novel. The novel was The English People, which was not successful. That was the attempt to write a novel, and he didn't succeed in this writing a novel. He wrote philosophical treatises, or he invented some new genre. I don't know how to put it, but in my opinion, they were not novels. Even the only attempt to write kind of fiction that was Night Operation, but it's too small to write to be a novel. There are no novels. What do you think?
It's a really good argument. I think that they may be thinking also further back to what are somewhat controversially called the ancient novels, Petronius, Apuleius, which are these sort of episodic entities around the size of what we have of a novel today, where nothing much really happens. There are lots of conversations, and this is very much what these sorts of novels, if we call them that, look like, with this mythic element. Right, I think Professor Hedley is absolutely right in what Coleridge thought. Barfield's quoting Steiner, saying that myth makes man and the archetypes he takes from them, and it's certainly you could almost say experimental, or at least formally diverse, at the fringes of novels. But and you think early 20th century, something like Fitzgerald's This Side of Paradise, people wouldn't call it a novel because it had some real formal experimentation going on, which now doesn't seem very extreme. So I think even, published in its time, it was sort of less so a novel. It's almost easier to see it as a novel today, but I think especially the Inkling context he was writing in, that's how he envisioned it, even though it is sort of just mostly dialogue. But I also think it's really helpful to consider, Dr. Guite, what you said elsewhere about the sort of tool that anti-Inkling circles used, where they're portrayed as just passing myths around to pass the time. I agree. I think this is something they took very seriously, and the novel is something that they absorbed or took as their medium. But yeah, there's definitely room for a debate there.
Could I just say that grandfather did actually finish writing English People, and it is available to be looked at if anybody wants to judge it for themselves. The problem was that he couldn't find a publisher, so the difficulty wasn't in writing a novel. The difficulty was in getting it published, which is quite often an issue. Grandfather had written a long narrative poem in 1924, which is called The Tower, and that's only just going to be published this August by an American publisher. So sometimes these things just take a long time to get published. They've been written, they're just taking their time to emerge.
Right, thank you very much. Good, I'm conscious of the time, and we've got another paper to come. So perhaps this is a good time to thank Jake for his wonderful paper, and to move on to our final speaker. Last but not least, Graham, you're going to be talking about taking us back to the Romantic era.
Yes, and my apologies probably for the longest paper and the least relevant to the afternoon, but it's in two parts, and there are sections, so I will let you know how we're getting on. The title is, in fact, Reason and the Primary Imagination, and I hope to connect the two. And I have an epigraph from a notebook. Speaking of the original unific consciousness, the primary perception, and its extreme difficulty, take occasion, Coleridge says, to draw a lively picture of the energies, self-denials, sacrifices, toils, trembling knees, and sweat drops on the brow of a philosopher who has really been sounding the depth of our being. I'm not going to make you sweat, but I hope I don't make you snore. So, my introduction. If, at its best, literary criticism is the analysis of the past in preparation for the future, a prose St. John preparing the way for a poetic Messiah, then, in my view, very little has done more damage to the prospects and recent history of English poetry than the almost wholly unquestioned and now institutionalized misreading of what Coleridge meant by the primary imagination. It is unfortunate that Coleridge himself appears to have provided us with only one definition as the living power and prime agent of all human perception. Although my purpose is to demonstrate that the power, if not the terminology, pervades both his and Wordsworth's thinking. That finite power in us, he then compares to the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am, a phrase about which he may have had some doubts. The British critical mind of the time, led by movements such as Imagism and relapsing into its natural and indolent materialism, latched onto that first phrase with relieved alacrity and a surprising lack of circumspection. Thus, Shawcross, the first 20th century editor of the Biographia, declared that the primary imagination is the organ of common perception and the faculty by which we have experience of an actual world of phenomena. I.A. Richards, a couple of decades later, one of the most influential of critics, writing and thinking alongside Eliot, said the same, but upped the rhetoric. The primary imagination is normal perception that produces the usual world of the senses, that inanimate cold world allowed to the poor, loveless, ever anxious crowd. The world, he goes on, of motor buses, beefsteaks, and acquaintances. Infamous and unfortunate words in diametric opposition to what I think Coleridge was actually saying in the dejection poems and elsewhere. That were that power alive in the individual, the power that Richards has relegated to passive perception, then would all things live from pole to pole, the rattling cold inanimate twigs of winter thus filled with the living sap of summer. And whatever that power is, it is not the particular province and genius of a poet, but a power in the dejection poems offered variously to Sarah Hutchinson, Edmund, a lady, Wordsworth, and Tom Poole. Sincere or not, what this variety suggests is that the power he is in search of belongs potentially to all, that it is not confined to poets, and therefore not the secondary imagination, and that all who are open to the working of that power could experience a new heaven and a new earth, undreamt of by the sensual and the proud. In writing his first letter, Coleridge declared that the power he felt missing in himself was one and the same as the lost power Wordsworth laments in the opening stanza of his ode. In the letter, Coleridge sums up this loss as, "I see them all so excellently fair, I see, not feel, how beautiful they are," echoing the difference between sight and feeling implicit in such lines of the ode as, "The rainbow comes and goes, and lovely is the rose," and later deliberately quoting the last line of the ode's first stanza, "The things which I have seen I now can see no more, but with the modest variation, they are not to me now the things which once they were," rightly suggesting that in fact those things haven't disappeared, as Wordsworth's rhetoric implies, for it is not the things themselves that need to be restored, but the vision of them. They need, in the words of Tintern Abbey, to be felt along the heart. So, section 1, the lost power in the dejection and immortality odes. Coleridge puts his loss down to the failure of his poetic imagination brought on by domestic distress and consequent abstruse research, his refuge from the pain of knowing he could not feel what he wanted to feel. As in the opening stanza of his ode, Wordsworth, for different reasons, struggled to feel the joy of a spring morning and was deeply disturbed that he couldn't. Everything Coleridge says around the time of dejection indicates that he thought the failure of his shaping spirit of imagination was, to use his later terminology, of the secondary imagination. I am going to suggest because he had yet to distinguish the primary and secondary imaginations, he was mistaken and so conflated the two. But this was some 14 or 15 years before that distinction appeared in the Biographia, although he had distinguished imagination from fancy as early as 1804. Therefore, as a necessary corollary, I will also be suggesting that the primary-secondary distinction is implicit in their poetry before either poet recognized the fact in their prose. If the verse letter indicates that Coleridge believed Wordsworth suffered the same loss of poetic power and might be repaired by the same cure, a happy marriage, Wordsworth accepted neither premise. There is no evidence anywhere in his verse or letters that he believed his power as a poet was in any way diminished, and I stress as a poet, for we should remember that in the 3 years between 1802 and 1805, not only did he write many shorter poems, but also completed both the Ode and the 1805 Prelude. The material or subject of his verse is his struggle to find and recover the hiding places of his power. And my question is, what power? For all through that struggle, he never questions his ability to write poetry, though he often, like Eliot, felt and fought the inadequacy of words, the sad incompetence of human speech. That self-belief is in stark contrast to Coleridge, who had hardly started writing poetry before he was tempted, unwisely, but frequently, to claim that the muse had abandoned him. It wasn't true. Many readers have noticed, but not adequately explained, the paradox that in dejection, Coleridge was proclaiming his loss in the very act of writing one of his finest poems. To say, as is often said, that loss is inspiration is no solution, because though loss may be the substance of a poem, of much love poetry, for instance, it doesn't help us to decide whether the poem itself is any good. That is, obviously enough, the loss and the poetry are not one and the same. If Wordsworth wasn't a failure in the secondary or poetic imagination, and we should remember that he set high store upon the Ode, where it included all his collections, what kind of loss did it present? I consider it a failure of the primary imagination, and it is that power, one facet of which Coleridge calls joy, the joy so conspicuously absent in Wordsworth's first 4 stanzas, that in Coleridge's words at the end of the dejection poems, by wedding nature to us gives in dower a new earth and new heaven. Or as Wordsworth put it, towards the conclusion of Home at Grasmere, the discerning intellect of man, when wedded to this goodly universe, will again reveal paradise and groves Elysian, a variant of a new heaven and a new earth. They look to the same vision, the wedding of mind and nature, divorced by Descartes. In the recognition of that loss, explored in both the Ode and dejection, lies the vision, the recovery of which, I argue, is the work not of the secondary, but of the primary imagination. Section 2 is called A Power Unmentioned in the Prose. Although the loss, the cause of that loss and the means of recovery are the key turning points of both poems, and so one would expect to be the subject of any discussion, their uncertainty about the power they seek is reflected in the prose of both poets. Nowhere in the 1815 preface or the supplementary essay, that's Wordsworth, and nowhere in the 2 volumes of the Biographia does either poet ever mention this sense of loss, nor that the power or function of the imagination might be to repair that separation of mind and nature. In all their ruminations on the imagination, that division is ignored. It is as if, dealing with the imagination in their prose, they could only envisage the poetic imagination. That is, their prose works limit the work of the imagination to the making of poetry, thus implying that the power that might restore their lost vision is of a different order. Coleridge's definition of a poet is as wonderful as it is well known. He diffuses a tone and spirit of unity that blends and, as it were, fuses each into each by that synthetic and magical power to which we have exclusively appropriated the name of imagination, and so on. There is no apparent recognition of the distinction made at the end of the previous chapter. Exclusively suggests the fancy and imagination distinction, not the primary and secondary. The limitations of Coleridge's magnificent prospectus are evident in his examples a few pages further on. His own dreadful lines on yon row of pines, I don't know whether you remember them, they are very bad, and how when the word visionary is added and their branches described as tresses wild, they become poetry. This is anthropomorphic pathetic fallacy at its worst. Though better verse, his illustrations from Shakespeare are still little more than examples of metaphors and similes. True, he does say what he said in 1802, that no man was ever yet a great poet without being, at the same time, a profound philosopher. But that thought peters out in generalizations, telling us nothing of what philosophy does. The achievements of his and Wordsworth's greatest poetry find no substantiation in anything he says, and when he comes to criticize Wordsworth's poetry, it will be along the lines of defects and beauties, nothing of Wordsworth as a philosopher. And yet, Coleridge had been on the verge of recognizing a distinction between the two forms of imagination as early as 1804. Speaking of his expectation that Wordsworth would be the first and greatest philosophical poet, and thus would become the only man who has effected a complete and constant synthesis of thought and feeling, and combined them with poetic forms, with the music of pleasurable passion, and with imagination, or the modifying power in that highest sense of the word in which I have ventured to oppose it to fancy, or the aggregating power in that sense in which it is a dim analogue of creation. So, the imagination in that highest sense of the word, a dim analogue of creation, must remind us of that subsidiary phrase in his definition of the primary imagination, a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. Yet this thought had lain fallow for years, and even when re-uttered in the Biographia, is given no development, no elucidation. And highest, or primary, suggests there is a lower, or secondary form, described here as the music of pleasurable passion. Wordsworth's discussion in the 1815 preface also depends on the fancy imagination distinction. And like Coleridge, he seems to touch on, though not illustrate, what might be considered a version of the primary function of the imagination. The imagination is conscious of an indestructible dominion. The soul may fall away from it, not being able to sustain its grandeur. But if once felt and acknowledged, by no act of any other faculty of the mind can it be relaxed, impaired, or diminished. Fancy is given to quicken and beguile the temporal part of our nature. Imagination to incite and support the eternal. There are echoes of the ode, the primal sympathy which having been must ever be. And that last thought, to incite and support the eternal, might remind us of how in the prelude, having accompanied the imagination in its course among the ways of nature, from its progress we drawn the feeling of life endless, the one thought by which we live, infinity and God. But Wordsworth, like Coleridge, makes no considered attempt to differentiate what might be thought of as two very different functions. That is curious, but it gets curiouser. So part 3, section 3, the most notable example of power unmentioned. The 1805 prelude, unpublished in Wordsworth's lifetime and known significantly as the poem to Coleridge, is a history of the imagination as that power had manifested itself in Wordsworth's experience, though not always in consistent or coherent ways. The first volume of the Biographia, which like the prelude has many digressions, is, finally, an attempt to deduce the imagination, the easing plastic or shaping power, from fundamental philosophical premises. Coleridge, admitting his failure, instead of a deduction, offered that cursory and confusing definition. But both men are essentially involved in the same task, working out in different ways the various implications of the term imagination. And what is implicit in Wordsworth's 1815 preface, that there are two forms of imagination, Coleridge makes explicit in the Biographia, briefly and enigmatically, at the end of chapter 13. But what must be considered astonishing in this respect, though entirely consistent with all that has gone before, is the absence of any kind of recognition, direct or indirect, of the great invocations to imagination in the poem to Coleridge by either poet at any time or in any place. How could either man write on the imagination and ignore entirely, for instance, even if quotation itself were impermissible, that magnificent address of Book 6? Here, that power in all the might of its endowments came athwart me. To my soul I say, I recognize thy glory. In such strength of usurpation, when the light of sense goes out in flashes that have shown to us the invisible world, doth greatness make abode. There harbours, whether we be young or old. The mind beneath such banners militant thinks not of spoils or trophies, blessed in thoughts that are their own perfection and reward. Strong in itself and in the access of joy, which hides it like the overflowing Nile. Note how joy floods back as the power of the imagination recovers. Whatever form of imagination this is, it is clearly different from the poetic imagination, to which the prose of each poet was largely limited. Both poets had a minimum of 10 years to think about this and many other comparable passages. And apart from that brief reference in Wordsworth's 1815 preface, the imagination is conscious of an indestructible dominion, to all intents, both ignored the finest things that Wordsworth had to say on the imagination. I think that's extraordinary. Now we're moving on to part 2, connecting reason and imagination. So, reason and imagination in the prelude. The word reason, critical to Coleridge's insight into intellectual or spiritual power, occurs more frequently in the prelude than imagination, which is odd given the poem's declared subject matter. But more significant is that at key moments, it occurs in conjunction with both nature and the imagination. And this appearance of reason is no latecomer to the party. If it's going to Grasmere, lines probably written around 1800, Wordsworth says, "On nature's invitation do I come, by reason sanctioned." So there are three things: nature, imagination, and reason. And perhaps the greatest of these is reason. Throughout the prelude, none of these three powers is fully distinguished. And in Book 12, there is that wonderful paean to their combined force, beginning with a reference to nature. I had been taught to reverence a power that is the very quality and shape and image of right reason, that matures her processes by steady laws, gives birth to no impatient or fallacious hopes, that holds up before the mind, intoxicate with present objects, and the busy dance of things that pass away, a temperate show of objects that endure. Nature and right reason are hardly distinguishable, both opposing the laws of vulgar sense, the falsest of all worlds, a universe of death, Milton's hell, presenting instead that which is divine and true, the objects that endure. Those objects, Wordsworth sums up in one word: love. For here do we begin and end. All grandeur comes, all truth and beauty from pervading love. That gone, we are as dust. Progressing through the modes of love, he concludes, this love more intellectual cannot be without imagination, which in truth is but another name for absolute strength and clearest insight, amplitude of mind, and reason in her most exalted mood. Imagination is reason in her most exalted mood. That connection with reason is never mentioned by Coleridge or Wordsworth in their prose discussions of the imagination. And though implicit in Coleridge's philosophic imagination, it is not a connection made, even if intended, in the Biographia. It is, as far as I know, not made by Coleridge, and then only tangentially, till the lay sermons some 12 years after Wordsworth had found reason on my point, that we are dealing with a power in the process of discovery, a power which both men tacitly understood as different from the poetic imagination, but were unable to distinguish or define satisfactorily. Coleridge said that a large part of philosophy was the definition of terms, and understanding those terms may well be the prerequisite for the revelation of a distinct power. I have in mind what he says about fancy and reason in an early poem, The Destiny of Nations. For fancy is the power that first unsensualizes the dark mind, giving it new delights, peopling air by obscure fears of beings invisible, emancipates from the grosser thrall of the present impulse, till superstition with unconscious hand seat reason on her throne. Read imagination for fancy, and we have something like the power that Wordsworth connected with reason. And we might add in the same spirit, superstition will morph into faith. Section 5. Is the philosophic imagination open to all? Jim Mays points out that the Statesman's Manual contains a prose version of the same argument. Some 20 years separate the two declarations. In 1829, Coleridge wrote a long note in a copy of The Friend, which included the remark, "It is wonderful how closely reason and imagination are connected, and religion the union of the two." That sounds like a discovery. It shouldn't have been. The Statesman's Manual had connected reason and imagination in producing the poetry of the Bible. Why had he taken so long to make a connection that Wordsworth had made in 1805 or before, that he knew Wordsworth had made, and he had made in between times? The answer, I think, which I've substantiated in a cut section, is because his study of reason, his philosophical wish to empower the term and its distinction from the understanding, distracted him from his and Wordsworth's rather simpler and more useful inserts into reason, which both of them had originally learned from Milton and the Cambridge Platonists. In the Biographia, he first links this part to the mystics, then to Kant, and to the notion of a philosophic or artificial consciousness, actualized by an effort of freedom, dividing all objects of human knowledge into those on this side and those on the other side of spontaneous consciousness, illustrated by the memorable metaphor of cis and transalpine Gaul, adding that citra et trans conscientem communem. But he also adds the caveat, the latter is exclusively the domain of pure philosophy. That surely separates it from Wordsworth's use of the term and seemingly from the imagination. But Coleridge is not consistent. Both the organs of sense, epitomized by those who live in Cisalpine Gaul, and the organs of spirit, as characterized by those who seek Transalpine Gaul, belong to all. And between them, as he says, there is communion, although the latter organs are not developed in all alike. However, because they do exist in all, they are capable of some degree of development in all, and their first appearance discloses itself in the moral being, says Coleridge, that is, through an act of will. One of Coleridge's most memorable metaphors, the butterfly or winged sylph bursting from the chrysalis, characterizes the difference between the spontaneous consciousness natural to all reflecting beings and the artificial consciousness of the philosopher. They and they only who understand that symbol can acquire the philosophic imagination, the sacred power of self-intuition, which potential he elsewhere equates to faith. What is curious, however, is that essentially this condemns to a death in life all those who are cut off from the transalpine territories of experience. And Coleridge paints a harsh picture of what it is to be without the sacred power of self-intuition, not to have the sense of freedom to explore the transalpine world. In such a person, all spiritual intercourse is interrupted, not only with others, but even with himself, In the fearful desert of his consciousness, he wearies himself out with empty words to which no friendly echo answers, either from his own heart or the heart of a fellow being, or he bewilders himself in the pursuit of notional phantoms by means of his own unenlivened and stagnant understanding. Unenlivened and stagnant, the mariner alone, unmoving on a wide, wide sea, all spiritual intercourse interrupted, the world rotting around him. The sky and the sea and the sea and the sky lay like a load on my weary eye. He thus belongs, in another expression of the same state, to the loveless, ever-anxious crowd. And surely Coleridge is not going to impose this death in life on all those who don't happen to be philosophers. It seems not, for he acknowledges that here is a sacred power, potential, in each and every one of us, what he calls, citing Wordsworth, the vision and the faculty divine, a line which in context distinguishes two powers. Oh, many are the poets that are sown by nature, men endowed with highest gifts, the vision and the faculty divine, yet wanting the accomplishment of verse. This is not a universal gift, but it is sown in many, and only wanting expression through lack of poetic ability. That he still ascribes the power to poets, inverted commas, poets who can't write poetry, illustrates his conflation of the two powers. And are not these two powers essentially primary and secondary? Wordsworth illustrates the vision and the faculty divine, the sacred power of self-intuition, in his meditation following the ascent of Snowdon. Nature, exhibiting the power of a mighty mind, feeding upon infinity, had thrust this image forth upon the senses, a power which higher minds bear with them as their own. Exercising this glorious faculty, such minds, in a world of life they live, by sensible impressions not enthralled, made thereby more fit to hold communion with the invisible world. Hence, the highest bliss that can be known is theirs, the consciousness of whom they are, habitually infused through every image and through every thought. Consciousness of whom they are and the sacred power of self-intuition are not distinguishable powers. And if that power is diffused through every image and every thought, then surely all things live from pole to pole, and subject and object are one, mind and nature happily wedded. The apparent paradox that this sensible impression has revealed the invisible world is resolved in their unity. Descartes has been trounced. That Coleridge wanted to connect reason and imagination in the biography is hardly in question. Why else begin a chapter entitled On the Imagination or Ease in Plastic Power with Milton's chain of being, ending with the soul receiving reason and reason is her being, discursive or intuitive. The only real surprise Coleridge's definition springs is not the fancy imagination distinction, long held and signalled throughout the biographia, but there are two kinds of imagination. How was reason going to fit in here? I have argued, I hope, that the exercise of reason as the sacred power of self-intuition and the exercise of a power we might now call the primary imagination would, had Coleridge's deduction succeeded, have been as closely related as they are in Wordsworth's poetry. A power exercised, at least in part, by the will, creating a unific consciousness, the primary perception, which, as the epigraph reminds us, is anything but passive. Section 6, the varieties of reason. So what is reason? We must answer that question before we can really determine the primary imagination is connected. But who or what is reason? A complex power with a variety of iterations in both Coleridge and Wordsworth. It is of us and of God, and it cannot be called a faculty, much less a personal property of any human mind. It goes back, as the biographia editors point out, to something like the direct intuitive reason of Plato. Coleridge declared in The Friend, God is reason, and elsewhere, mens ipsissima, the mind most itself, and therefore a power outside ourselves, akin to Wordsworth's dread power, whose gracious favour is the primal source of all illumination. Note, illumination, the world rendered intelligible, sacramental, not mere passive perception, a power which prevents this majestic imagery, the clouds, the ocean, the firmament of heaven, from being a barren picture on the mind, as Wordsworth put it. The power which, through his guardian saint, came to the mariner's rescue, removing the load from his weary eye, the rotting world of 1,000 slimy things, so changed that no tongue their beauty might declare. But as he also said in the Opus Maximum, to suppose God without ideas, or the realizing knowledge of all the particular forms potentially involved in absolute causativeness, would destroy the very conception of God. So, taking the finite version of the infinite, reason is the power to generate ideas, and these ideas are powers, not concepts or deductions. A late note declares them to be living truths, the living truths, that may be re-excited but cannot be expressed by words, the transcendence that give the objectivity to all objects, the form to all images, that are themselves untranslatable into any image, unpresentable by any particular object. To name was to risk conceptualizing, and Coleridge wanted the ideas to remain powers. Earlier, he had been willing to name the ideas of reason, much as Blake named mercy, pity, peace, and love, the human form divine. Coleridge proposed such ideas as justice, freedom, and beauty. And now, final section, two brief examples of the primary imagination at work. That enables us to see how the primary imagination might work. Coleridge provides the first example. This is a beautiful, beautiful entry in his notebooks, which I have a very short version of. Musing, he says in August 1826, on the ordinary exclusive attribution of reality to the phenomena of the passive sense, which he calls a sensual trance, he wonders how this state might be compatible with living a life of grace by faith, that is, a condition comparable to the mariner's after his prayer has been answered. Looking at the lovely lacework of those fair elm trees, I received the solution of my difficulty flash-like in the word beauty, in the intuition of the beautiful. This too is spiritual, and the goodness of God. This is the shorthand, hieroglyphic of truth, the mediator between truth and feeling, the head and the heart. Beauty is implicit knowledge, a silent communion of the spirit with the spirit in nature. Momentarily, Coleridge had had an experience of that complete synthesis of thought and feeling he believed Wordsworth might achieve constantly. Head and heart at one, mediated by the power of beauty, his life wedded to the life of nature. It is one of the happiest moments of the notebooks. But this fine landscape, if looked at passively in a sensual trance, the sleep of death, as Wordsworth called it, without any intuition of the beautiful, with the eyes of the aesthete or the refined sensuous, the pure tutos cosmos man, would be no more than what a fine specimen of calligraphy would be to an unalphabeted rustic. Or it would be, in Wordsworth's phrase, a barren picture on the mind. The intuition of the beautiful is the goodness of God. No God, no ideas by which to rule the world. And if mercy is an idea of reason, an educt of the primary imagination, we can look back and see how this power might have always worked. One facet of the human form divine, its absence dehumanizes. As the Duke says of Shylock, an inhuman wretch, incapable of pity, void and empty from any dram of mercy. Mercy is 3 times invoked before Portia's speech, who then brings all the powers of the secondary imagination to bear on this idea, so that it is formed and reformed, dissolved, diffused, dissipated, in order to be recreated in our consciousness. And in doing so, she returns to the essence of the idea, as she says, mercy, it is an attribute to God himself. Final paragraph. But I have simplified in order to clarify what neither Wordsworth nor Coleridge fully realized. The best of what they had to say was not transmitted, nor then transmissible to the next generation. Browning mocked. Transcendentalism, a poem in 12 books, is but 50 lines. Tennyson sentimentalized. Arnold moralized. Swinburne, unsupported by the ideas that Carlyle downgraded to metaphysical swim-bladders, drowned in a sea of words. The severity, centrality, and divinity of ideas were, in various degrees, abandoned. Their hue, perpetina philosophia in perpetinam, etc. A hunger-bitten and idealist philosophy naturally produces a starveling and comfortless poetry. Perhaps poets don't come out of universities. Let's hope not. Or if they do, and we continue to promulgate the 100 years of nonsense about the primary imagination as the agent of passive perception, then what hope for English poetry, now enthralled by sensible impressions, intoxicate with present objects? That's it.
Thank you, Graham. Well, I think it's most appropriate that we should finish with a very profound lecture on Wordsworth and Coleridge, and I think touching on a number of themes absolutely central for Barfield. If I just in passing, before I open the discussion, I'd just like to mention that Plotinus speaks of nous, or the consciousness of intellect, as that which all possess but few use.
I think Coleridge probably had that in mind.
So, questions for Graham?
None.
I'll go. Thank you for that really rich and provocative talk to finish off this wonderful day. In thinking about this reunification of perception and spirit, I keep thinking back to where you began us with the dejection poem, and to the invocation of joy in that, which picks up on some of the earlier questions as well. To what extent do you see the experience of joy that Coleridge is that he's putting into verse there? Do you see that as completely eschatological, if you will, right? A sort of invocation of Isaiah's marriage of heaven and earth, and its celebration of joy, and to what extent is Coleridge seeking to entirely realize that in a life here and now?
I think the answer is quite difficult, because I think in some senses his joy, his personal joy would have been a happy marriage. You know, it's kind of that simple in one way. And the whole idea behind the regeneration in dejection is essentially, let's create a household that really works. And he's saying this, Wordsworth is about to get married. Wordsworth's own household is in a peculiar state. He's saying, let's get the household organized. My capacity for joy is completely ruined by my domestic life. Let's get you back together, and you will then go on. Wordsworth was getting a bit stuck. I mean, Coleridge saw these first 4 verses first and reacted to them. He thought, crikey, Wordsworth's stuck. Wordsworth can't do what we believe. You know, jointly we believe we're going to reunite mind and nature. It is their great joint task. And he suddenly sees, oh goodness, Wordsworth's about to fail. So in that sense, it's entirely personal that, you know, that they might really create a domestic happiness and joy arises there. But if you read, you know, I'm trying to remember a quotation, really, Wordsworth says somewhere, joy is at the heart of the universe. Malcolm might be able to come back with a quote, but essentially, they believe that joy is the luminousness, the power that comes forth. You know, so it's not just a kind of happiness. It's a real central power, but it is expressed as a feeling. And this is where I was trying to sort of think about earlier, the connection between knowing something and feeling something. If you have that sense of joy, then you are really knowing the connection between mind and nature, which is at the heart of the universe.
Yeah, if I could just respond to that. Just first off to say, Graham, I enjoyed your paper. There's particular things you and I might disagree about, but I think one of the essential things that was going on there, which really relates actually right back to our Cambridge Platonists foundation in here, is the notion of the idea as a living power, rather than a thing that happens inside the kind of isolated concavity of somebody's skull. And that's something to bring Barfield in, that Barfield is very keen on. That when we're thinking, we are participating in or partaking in ideas which are not our private possessions, but living powers which articulate us as much as we articulate them. So I wanted to just to say that I thought that, and reason is such a living power. So I was with you on that. To go back to Jacob's question about, is joy eschatological? I think the answer, I would say, specifically in the Dejection Ode, Coleridge uses a deliberate quotation from the prime book of eschatology, that is to say, the Revelation of John the Divine, when he says that joy, that luminous power, is the new heaven and the new earth, undreamt of by the sensual and the proud. So he is locating it in that. Yeah. But he is also saying that it can in some sense be realized or anticipated. So I think he's getting himself into, although he wouldn't have articulated it in this way, that later on he would have articulated it this way, but he's into precisely that tension between the now and the not yet. And particularly in the way that the spirit is the pledge or the down payment, as it were, the anticipatory realization in us of that eschaton. In that sense, the beginning of the new age. I mean, I do think that there is I think there is a reach into the final realization of things in the eschaton in the way he uses joy. But he also recognizes that the visitations of joy here are a sort of sustaining thing. But I think you were right, Jacob, to ask the eschatological question, because it's there in the direct allusion to. I also completely agree about the idea that there is an intuition, I think, in both Wordsworth and Coleridge, more expressed in Wordsworth's poetry than in Coleridge's, that joy is at the center of all things, that it is the heart, you know,
I can't remember the quote myself. But
but also the sense of coming trailing clouds of glory, the sense that inland far we be, the sense that the mariner, when the mariner is in the absolute utter loneliness of his alienation and the load on his eye and all of that, is actually not seeing things as they really are. The horror and isolation of the life and death is in fact a temporary mental construct of the alienated individual and not the way things actually are.
Well, Malcolm, he's the person in the cisalpine land, and he hasn't moved over to the transalpine.
The moonrise and the revelation of the creatures as happy living things and the blessing, that's not a passing mood. That's an insight into how things are. And I mean, the one thing I just want to throw in, I've said too much, but simple thing is the thing that in the Biographia, albeit 20 years after the event, when he asks what it is and answers what it is that he and Wordsworth thought they were up to in that Annus Mirabilis when they wrote the lyrical ballads, he ascribes this to Wordsworth, but I think it's actually true of both of them. He doesn't say we were trying to make some sort of subjective compensation for the otherwise pointless grimness of things, which is the role that seems to be assigned to poetry now. What he actually says is that they were awakening the mind's attention, removing a film of familiarity. And in that sense, I think they saw poetry and the poetic imagination as an instrument for finding out what is the case. That the poetic imagination is a truth-bearing faculty, it's not wishful thinking. And that the problem with reason, not in its greatest senses, not in the sense that you've just articulated, Graham, but a detached, analytic, essentially materialistic process, what Coleridge called littleism, or the despotism of the eye, that's giving us a false reading, if you like. And in a sense, I think he thought that the kind of poetry he and Wordsworth were up to was itself, in its own way, a kind of scientific instrument. It was, you know, he was cleansing the lens of something that indicates what is the case.
Yep. Yep, I think so. And I mean, just taking up your notion of ideas, he didn't want to articulate or name the ideas. There's something a little, it's only in relation to flowers, but he says, always deadened by their learned names. And I think this is the trouble with things, you know, we iterate the idea like of mercy so easily, but actually we need to come to the notion that it's a power that we need to rediscover in us. And we don't just use it as a name. It isn't just a nominalist thing, it's got to be discovered as a real thing. And it then becomes, the name then becomes a power. But the interesting thing about ideas with Coleridge, as he progressed through his life and career, he more and more refused to name ideas and more wanted to think of them as powers.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions for Graham?
Can I ask a question to the group? It may be for Graham, but maybe for any of you who've spoken today. Thinking about this relation of ideas to powers puts me in mind of the use that Barfield makes of the notion of polarity, right? Which he's of course getting from Coleridge. And it's so central, but often so puzzling in Barfield, the way he speaks about it. And I think it's related to this notion of something that's representable, but not comprehensible, something that can only be known through a saltus or an elevation to of the consciousness or the mind or the entire being to grasp this relationship of polarity, which I take Barfield to be saying is the fundamental relationship between spirit and nature. So it gets very close to this whole question of the imagination and the joy that accompanies its realization and so forth. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Well, to me, the whole problem goes back to, the problem identified by the Cambridge Platonists, that you start using reason in the Baconian and the Cartesian way, you end up with your, a mind on the one hand and an objective or natural world on the other. And Cudworth puts it very essentially, you end up with essentially a mechanical and godless world.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
It is, if you like, where do you find the power common to both? And Coleridge and Wordsworth are really saying that essentially the power in us is the power in nature, but we have to relocate it, we have to rediscover it, and the poetry is the vehicle by which they present it. But I don't know, it's not the means by which they achieve it. They achieve it, I think, by the generation of the ideas of reason. And they're really saying what Coleridge says in the Biographia: sensation is but vision nascence. It's nature is part of the intellectual growth of the whole world. It's just, we're all one continuity, really. But how we find that connection is the real problem.
May I come in here with a quotation from the modestly named John Smith, but as Coleridge said, not the least star of that great galaxy of Cambridge men, where Smith in the first of his select discourses says, "We shall therefore as a prolegomenon or preface to what we shall afterward discourse upon the heads of divinity, speak something of this true method of knowing, which is not so much by notions as actions, as religion itself consists not so much in words as things. They are not always the best skilled in divinity, that are the most studied in those pandects which it is sometimes digested into, or that have erected the greatest monopolies of art and science. He that is most practical in divine things hath the purest and sincerest knowledge of them, and not he that is most dogmatical. And here it is. Divinity, indeed, is a true efflux from the eternal light, which, like the sunbeams, does not only enlighten, but heat and enliven. And therefore our Saviour hath in his Beatitudes connected purity of heart with the beatifical vision. As the eye cannot behold the sun unless it be sunlike, and hath the form and resemblance of the sun drawn into it, so neither can the soul of man behold God unless it be godlike, hath God formed in it, and be made partaker of the divine nature.
Brilliant.
So that's just a wonderful passage. I mean, just quoting Plotinus and St. Paul.
That's wonderful.
Yeah,
But
I think that's
Douglas,
very Barfieldian. Sorry?
Nor can we behold nature unless it is also godlike. And so we have to discover what
Yeah.
Wordsworth and Coleridge were saying, we are discovering what the godlike is in nature, where the power that is divine exists in nature.
Yes.
Blake is interesting on that, actually. Blake's got quite a lot about the sun and the eye in different places. But I always like, that little one in the Auguries of Innocence, when he says, if the sun began to doubt, it would immediately go out. Where he sees all the phenomena of nature, including the sun as the eye, as participatory in God and not able to exist as they are if they cease to participate.
And I think Barfield is interesting, where he's talking about I think he calls it the double vision somewhere of the imagination. And in fact, he quotes Blake at that point. He uses this image of Blake that, the sun would only be, it's the guinea image that Blake is using.
When Blake in the catalogue for the 1810 exhibition says, the time will come when the sun rises and someone will say to you, what do you not behold a round disc somewhat the size of a guinea? And you must reply, no, no, no. I see the innumerable hosts of heaven crying, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty.
Yes, yeah. And I think this is a very intriguing notion that this imaginative vision is a vision that is at the same time the empirical perception, but also the perception of the intelligible at the same time. Of course, expressed symbolically as the host of heaven.
Yeah, well, intelligible is the key word as well in the early poem of Coleridge, where he speaks of the appearances of nature as the lovely shapes and sounds intelligible of that eternal language which thy God utters.
Yes, yes.
And in Tinton Abbey, key word in Tinton Abbey too.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, unless there are any more questions, I think this is a good point to close our reflections. But I would like to say that I'm very grateful to Gareth Polmeer and to Jake Grefenstette, who are really the inaugurators of this mini workshop, because without their enthusiasm, this wouldn't have happened. And so I'm very grateful to them for their enthusiasm, which I must confess is contagious. So I've rediscovered Barfield with great joy, joy in both the mundane sense and I hope perhaps even in the Barfieldian sense. So thank you very much to both Jake and to Gareth, and in fact to everybody for contributing to what I've found as a very helpful discussion.
No, thank you very much to Douglas for hosting it through the centre, and you know, thank you to everybody for your presentations today. And it's been wonderful to meet a community of interests in Barfield. And yeah, Douglas and I have been speaking about this for a number of months. I'm very much hoping this can be the beginnings of some other connections as well, and that we might find some opportunity to continue. I think it's great that we've been able to do it in isolation, so to speak, as well, to come together and share the ideas. So
can I thank Owen Barfield, the younger Owen Barfield,
Absolutely.
very well, for the extraordinary work that he's done in getting these Barfieldian texts out to us and setting the word out, and especially now, you know, things like Eager Spring and Night Operation and so on. I really think that's going to do great good. And I do feel that, you know, we're at the beginning of something here. I think Barfield's work has so much to show us in terms of how we move into new ways of integrating reason and imagination and changing the way we relate to the world. Some of which may, in a curious way, paradoxically be accelerated by this current world crisis. I think the experience of isolation in one respect should renew a serious consideration of what participation is when we come to participate outwardly and visibly again.
Well, thank you for your kind words, but can I just point out, it's not me at all, it's people like you. It's you and your fellows and your community that are doing this. I just sort of sit here smiling, but it's all thanks to what you are doing, and other people are appreciating it, especially me. Thank you.
Well, let's hope that this can be the beginning of you know, of further projects.
Yes, a few words. Well, just to say thank you to everyone. And if I try to find words just to express the feeling, I could say the felt change of consciousness is a good expression.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I promise when we reconvene, I will have gone back and revised my knowledge of Barfield, which I'm very sorry I didn't produce today.
Jacob, great to see you, by the way. Just I wave across from one window.
Okay.
Thanks all.
Well, thank you very much.
Everyone.
Right.
Bye.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
thanks.